Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, the world's first pro-cancer, pro-poverty and pro-climate change charity. This week's episode is on the Conquest of Bread, a seminal work of anarcho-communism written by pre-Kropotkin and first published in French in 1892. Kropotkin was born in Moscow in 1842 to an aristocratic serf and land-owning family, his father being a royal officer. Kropotkin, sympathetic to his family's serfs and living in a time of revolutions throughout Europe, came to oppose not only the Tsarist system, but all non-anarchist systems of government, and left behind a promising career as a geographer and naturalist to dedicate himself to more socially useful pursuits, in his own words. This entailed Kropotkin getting involved in various revolutionary organisations, and, as a result, being imprisoned in both Russia and France, as well as being chased out of Switzerland at the request of the Russian government. He eventually ended up in London, where he continued to write and organise. He returned to Russia in 1917, initially full of hope because of the revolutions, but this turned to disappointment, as the Bolsheviks represented a strand of communism he felt was too authoritarian, and antithetical to the anarchist principles he held for most of his life. He died in 1921, a prominent figure in the diminished Russian anarchist movement. The Conquest of Bread sees Kropotkin taking shots at the feudalist and capitalist systems ruling in Europe at the time of writing, as well as at authoritarian communism, that is to say, Marxism. He describes how anarchist revolutions can be successful, and sketches out his vision of a society in which goods and services are distributed purely on the basis of need. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to Heilich, Nick B, J-Man, Not San Marzano Supremacy, Abraxas, and At Double Speed, our lovely Patreon subscribers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's thanks to you that this podcast is no longer losing money. So, if you're ready to finally understand what all these bread posting memes are about, then listen on. Enjoy. So what did you think of this book actually? Because some aspects of it are at least somewhat directionally similar to what you think, and aspects of it are completely different to how you think the world should be run.
Yeah, this actually turned out to be one of the more fun books that we've read. Not because I agree with it, but because it was just... I found myself both agreeing at least sentimentally with some aspects of it and then strongly disagreeing with other aspects of it. So it was a bit of a roller coaster ride. The other part of it that was really interesting was that he makes references to a lot of 18th and 19th century historical events in Europe and other thinkers who I haven't necessarily read a lot of. And so I spent a lot of my time reading this book wasn't even reading the book. It was just looking at the different years and events that he was referring to. In particular, like I found out about this thing, which I'm sure like all Europeans would know about, at least to some extent. I think it's called the springtime of the nations, or the springtime of revolution, or the revolutionary spring.
In 1848.
Yeah, where there was like so many revolutions occurring simultaneously. And yeah, I just found all that stuff really interesting. So if nothing else, it was a historically interesting read.
Yeah, it was historically interesting because I had sort of a first sentence of a Wikipedia page knowledge of a lot of the historical events that he's referring to. Now I have maybe the first 5 sentences in terms of knowledge on those events. Which is a pretty significant expansion of knowledge, at least in relative terms. The absolute level of knowledge is probably not that great. Yeah, it was really interesting from that perspective. This book is really interesting in that he has identified real problems that are very much worthwhile in trying to address. I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that his proposed solutions didn't resonate with me quite as much. But he does identify problems that are still relevant today, or at least some of the problems are still very much relevant today. And the book is still influential today. I didn't know this, but did you know that the Occupy movement, you know that it was particularly in the United States, that left-wing movement that arose in response to the financial crisis, was a lot of the organisers of that were influenced by Kropotkin.
Yeah, well, that was an anarchistic movement, right? I guess so.
Somewhat. It was
pretty varied.
kind of garbled what they actually wanted
Yeah,
beyond complaint.
yeah. Yeah, not surprised at all that this has been an influential book. It was originally published in French, and he's Russian, originally published in French and then translated in English like 5 years after or something.
Yeah.
I can only assume that he's a good writer, but at least the English version that I read was well written. And look, I have a bunch of issues with socialism, but like putting those aside, he's definitely like capitalizing on the fervor of the time. And so definitely understand why it could have been influential. Plus, he published in Paris as well, so there's probably a lot of people receptive to that sort of stuff when he published.
Yeah. The guy had a pretty interesting life as well.
Really interesting life.
Yeah, because he was born in Moscow in 1842, and he was born to an aristocratic family because his father was a prince, and he was obviously a really smart guy because he had success in his life when he was younger, particularly as a geographer, and also in terms of biology, like as a naturalist. But he decided to pursue social justice as his calling rather than geography. As such, he was imprisoned in Russia, but escaped. Then lived in Switzerland until he was expelled on the request of the Russian government from Switzerland after radicals assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Interestingly, that assassination led to a lot of crackdowns in Europe, particularly on anarchists, even though the organization, the People's Will in Russia, responsible for it, I don't think was an anarchist organization. I think they were leftist terrorists and associated with the socialist movement, but I'm not sure if they were anarchists. Anyway, yeah, he was kicked out of Switzerland for that. Went to France, got arrested and imprisoned there for 3 years on charges of sedition, then moved to England. He was there until 1917 because at that point in history, the English just prosecuted radicals less than in other countries, I guess. But yeah, he moved back to Russia in 1917. Quite sad, actually, in that he seemed to be quite hopeful for the Russian Revolution, sort of after the February Revolution
in
1917. But then when the Bolsheviks took power in the October Revolution, he became a lot more pessimistic because, as we will discuss, because it's one of the more interesting parts of this book, he had real problems with Marxist communism and what he called authoritarian communism, which is what the Bolsheviks, not only to him, I think just it's difficult to argue that the Bolsheviks don't represent an authoritarian strain of communism.
Yeah. See, he's one of these people who I think, even though I disagree with, well, one, he gets points for not killing anyone. Although his ideas might have led to, or
not an anti-Semite either. At least in this book, there's not anti-Semitism. Which,
yeah, not here.
Given this podcast's usual subject matter, is still a big plus point. I don't have to wade through anti-Semitism.
But he really was sincere.
Yes,
he really stuck by what he meant. He wasn't just one of these grandstanding people. Like some of the people that we've read, especially on the sort of alt-righty sort of vibes.
Yeah, it's just pure LARP.
Yeah. For example, I think roaring nationalism doesn't. It's like, if you're not actually posting pictures of your yoked body on Twitter, then how do I know that you're actually being authentic? Whereas this guy like got kicked out of 3 countries for sticking to his beliefs.
Went to prison. And then when he returned to Russia in 1917, he was offered, I think, the ministership for education and said no because he doesn't believe in government.
Fuck yeah. That's pretty Chad. That is a Chad move. Fuck yeah.
Yeah, this guy was sincere. He definitely wasn't LARPing.
And I think he was also...
Yeah, you're right. It's particularly like the BAP Twitter part of what we've read for this, which is just pure live action role playing.
For sure. He was also...
Yeah.
What would you say? He's a sensitive boy. He's clearly
He was
clearly a
sensitive
sensitive person. And look, that sensitivity comes through as deep resentment at times. Well, actually, a lot of his book is deeply resentful, but it also comes through as like you can see that he cares about. So he came from an aristocratic family, or at least like a middle class family at the very least.
I think his dad was a prince.
Yeah, or his grandfather or something. And so something to that effect. Anyways, he didn't have to grow up in. Oh yeah, and then he was taken into the Tsar's boarding school. That's right. He went to some ball. I read this just on Wikipedia. Go and fact check it. That he went to a ball when he was like 14 years old, where the Tsar was attending the ball, and he was so well dressed that the Tsar was impressed. The Tsar like offered him full attendance at some special school. And so he actually went to...
Just because of his grills.
Just because of his grills, yeah, and his face tat. Nice. He didn't have to... if you think, well, there was a large portion of the population who probably had his family social background. Maybe not a large portion, but a significant portion. And they didn't necessarily become bleeding hearts for the serf or the former serf class. Whereas he actually took it on board, took his experiences on board, and thought that the world could do better.
Yeah. It was also interesting the time in which he was living was a time in which it would be much easier to see the world eventually being engulfed in particularly anarcho-communist revolution, but revolutions in general. Not to say it can't happen again, but we've lived through a time, at least in the West, of stability or relative stability, whereas he lived in a very, very febrile time. And during his lifetime, he saw enormous changes.
Huge.
When he was... Because he would have only been 20 or something when Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs, which was in... It's complicated, but the events leading to that, the revolutions of 1848, so I mean, he would have been like 4 or something when those were happening, so he wouldn't have been cognizant of those events. But a lot of the demands of the revolutionaries in 1848 eventually did come to pass in the subsequent 30 years or so, 20, 30 years, after most of those revolutionary movements were put down by conservative forces. Because, for example, you had Tsar Alexander II in the 1860s, I think, who emancipated the serfs. You had von Bismarck in Germany, or in first Prussia, and then taking control of various German states from the Austrians and the French, instituting things that we would now recognize as the precursors to the welfare state. The sorts of demands of people in 1848 were working their way through the political systems of Europe when Kropotkin was alive. And he also saw the Paris Commune as well. There was so much political instability that tended in the direction that Kropotkin wanted that it's very easy to see how someone could see that world and say, yep, the world is headed in one way or another towards anarcho-communism, or at least some form of anarchism. Whereas we live in a world now where it's not really a mass movement anymore. The last gasp of it was probably the Spanish Civil War, where you had groups like the POUM, which had a lot of popular support and could command troops and things like that, but weren't, in part because of anarchist ideology, weren't nearly as organised as the authoritarian communists, who in large part betrayed the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, or the fascists, who had absolutely no problem with authoritarianism. they in fact quite like it. But yeah, it's interesting looking back, given that we live in a time where anarchism is not really a meaningful political movement at large scale.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So why are we giving all this historical context? We're giving this historical context because
we can read Wikipedia.
Because we can read Wikipedia.
We want to show off.
We want to show off. And it's also really interesting to try to frame this. I think, well, anybody's writing potentially, but especially Kropotkin, I found really interesting to frame what he was writing about in his historical context.
Yeah, and also some listeners said that they'd prefer it if we gave a bit more historical context to things. Shout out to Yarp.
Yarp.
Which is not unreasonable. So we're going to be doing our best impression of people who are historically aware this episode and in subsequent episodes as well.
Yeah, to the degree that it doesn't make it completely boring for listeners other than Yarp.
No, I was wanting this just to be a lore dump. We're going to lore dump on the Paris Commune for 4 hours, then eventually we might get around to discussing the Conquest of Bread.
There was one really interesting piece of history that I was reading about with the French Revolution. There was this guy, I can't remember his name. Damn, what was his name? Marquis Comte something. Anyways, he was one of the leaders of the Third Estate. The Third Estate are like was the working classes and representatives of the working class. And there was this one confrontation they had with like the royalists in Paris, and the guy was like, his opponent was saying, "You must leave. You can't get the Third Estate to ally with the First and the Second Estate." And the guy replied, "Yeah, we're not going to leave here except at the end of bayonets." There's like this really famous quote, and that guy was actually the first guy who was buried in the Pantheon or Pantheon, whatever the thing is in Paris, where French people bury really important people. And I thought that quote actually summed up a lot of what was going on. You can't get us out of this situation unless you actually take it to the point of the, like in this case, bayonets. And that kind of
did happen.
Yeah, it happened a lot. And that characterized basically, you could think sort of 18th, like mid to late 18th century, all the way up until essentially the end of the Second World War, really. It was like a huge period of just non-stop, maybe periods of rest and relative stability punctuated by revolutions and uprisings and that sort of thing. It was a very turbulent time in European history compared to last 50 years.
Because there was, apart from that, there was a period of 20 or so years when Bismarck was, I think, imperial chancellor in the newly unified Germany, or at least a bunch of German states had been brought under Prussian control, where he worked really, really hard to prevent wars in continental Europe, and it was relatively stable. But either side of that, it's just typical European history, which is so tumultuous.
One of the things... Sorry, go on.
Europe has been, at least in our lifetimes, fairly laid back in terms of not killing itself.
Each other. Yeah.
That it's easy to forget just how extreme Europeans are in terms of coming up with ideologies and justifications for mass violence. Europeans are wild.
Yeah, when you read most of human history, a lot of human history in different parts of the world, I've noticed that, there'll always be violence. Say, for example, one of my favorite examples is the Comanche? The Comanche in Northern America. They're really violent people. they like enslaved their neighboring, this idea of the noble savage and, just living in peace and harmony with nature and one another. That was not the Comanche. They loved riding horses and enslaving people. And they were, and there's a lot of people now who they might have Navajo or Apache heritage as well, but they're like from a Comanche group, but it's because their great-great-grandmother or whatever was taken as a slave or as like a concubine or something by the Comanche. And so there's that all over human history, but I guess the kicker with Western Europe in particular, but I suppose if you extended it to Russia, as far as Russia and maybe even the Ottomans, is they also developed really advanced technology for killing each other.
Yeah.
And had large populations and a lot of wealth over the course of the last, say, 1,000 years, developed a lot of wealth and large populations. But to have that technology and development directed towards machines of war, it's led to some pretty bad outcomes.
Well, it's a relatively large and very technologically advanced population in a relatively small geographic area. And also, well, I guess it depends on your definitions of technology. So you could just define it as social technologies, the organization that Europeans also had.
Yeah.
They were very organized when it came to massacring each other.
Yeah. I consider organizational structures a technology.
Yeah. So I guess, in terms of historical context, it was business as usual in Europe, which means it was really violent, but organized violence.
And organized, yeah. They were very organized. So it's super interesting. So this guy, the other part of this discussion, why giving a bit more historical context to Kropotkin is important, is because of what I term, I don't know if this is used other work in other places, but in my own head, I'm not stealing this from somebody else, but I call it historical empathy. So trying to get better at having historical empathy, especially for people that one disagrees with. You could also think of it just contextual empathy if it's a writer who's like, if it's somebody who's writing now and you're reading them, not to just sort of dismiss their perspective because it's radically different from my own, but to actually take into consideration the context and, as Popper would say, their problem situation. So it's not just what problem are they solving, but what's the situation around it. And with Kropotkin, one of the things that stood out to me was that he has not benefited from the last, say, 150 years or so of further economic development and expansion and deepening of markets and all that sort of stuff that we've had, and the rise of the global middle class. And so he was living through this period at the end of the Middle Ages, sort of like the abolition of serfdom and stuff, where there were these parallels between the emerging capitalist economy in Europe and the old serf and aristocratic structure. And so he was making these correspondences, and Marx did this as well and stuff, and the other socialists made these correspondences between, say, the aristocracy or the landed gentry and the capital owners. And to be fair, I assume that probably a lot of the capital owners may have been landed gentry or whatever, or descendants of landed gentry. But that's not built into the social structure, which is where, like, Marx's historical materialism, like, doesn't actually make sense. And so he was looking at this, like, intensely oppressive social structure and then thinking that, well, capitalism is just a new form of that.
Yeah. And I guess this is not really defending Kropotkin, and this is defending the branch of communism that he didn't like. But at least in terms of the development of the global middle class, you could maybe steelman that argument by referencing Marxism-Leninism. So particularly in capitalism, the imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. By Lenin talks about how capitalist countries have basically offshored working class misery to poor countries so that they can buy off their own proletariats with higher standards of living, better wages, shorter working hours, but immiserating workers in faraway countries. I guess like that might be a response to what you were saying.
Yeah, and I guess now we can start talking. Well, this is probably a good segue into talking about Kropotkin more directly, because that gets onto one of the core central. Is it fallacy or is it just an error, mistake? Just error, in my opinion, of socialism in general. All the various forms I've seen is that they have a zero-sum mentality towards wealth creation. They think it's just like somebody has to be oppressed in order for there to be wealth created.
Yeah.
And that permeates like all of their thinking, and including Kropotkin. And it originally
and I guess it depends on how you define oppression as well, because it seems to me that oftentimes if two people engage in some sort of business deal or something like that, and one party comes off better than another, even if they both benefit, certain people will look at that and say that's oppression, and certain people will look at that and say, well, one person's done better than the other, but that's not necessarily predatory. And how one views that oftentimes will determine whether they're more instinctively capitalist or socialist or even communist.
Yeah. And I mean, we can definitely discuss maybe towards the end of the episode my main or a couple of my main criticisms that I think just like eat through those discussions and cut to the chase on those. But maybe we should discuss Kropotkin more
Will that
directly.
be how when during the Yavin episode I was Yavin bot and trying my best to offer a Yavinite response, and this time I had to be Kropotkin bot.
Yeah. Although I don't want to just
my best steelman of Kropotkin.
I don't want to just offload all the steel manning to you. Like, I have put in a little bit more effort to try to understand. You don't have to be Kropotkin bot. I just think that there were certain fundamental errors in their understanding of economics that still people have today and haven't permeated into the rest of the world, that just come through in this sort of thinking that doesn't hold up anymore. But
Yeah.
anyways.
Before we talk about Kropotkin, do you want to talk a bit about socialism and communism in the time of Kropotkin? Because a lot of this book is him addressing arguments within the socialist and communist movements.
Yeah, I have a bunch of notes about that, actually. So,
because this was one of the parts of the book that was really interesting, because a lot of what he talks about in the Conquest of Bread is actually addressing what he refers to as authoritarian communists, which is basically Marxism. We can get into the history of the split within the communist movement between particularly the anarchists led by Bakunin and what we more think of as communists today, led by Marx and the First International, because that's really important in this book.
yeah.
And it's one of the really interesting parts.
So socialism is a very large and complex, I would say, network of interrelated ideas. And the core...
That's a good way to put it, because it's not one thing. Yeah, it's more of a network.
And if you had to say there's one primary characteristic of socialism, it would be the social ownership of the means of production, as opposed to the private ownership. And there are various forms of that. That could mean anything from by social ownership, that could be a small community, they divide up the way who uses what machines, who uses what pieces of land. It could be cooperatives, workers' cooperatives. It could be unions. It could be all the way to state communism, where the state is the vehicle through which public ownership of all the means of production takes place. So the question being, well, what is the means of production? The means of production are essentially just those bits of machinery, assets, land that are used to make other things. So you have consumer goods, which are like the things at the end of any production chain that actually get consumed in the final analysis. And then there's the things that go to make them. So a good example would be like making banana bread. The banana bread is the consumable, and all the utensils, the oven, the labor, the productive land that went to growing the bananas, all those things are potentially considered the means of production. Mm-hmm. And in particular, there's generally three main things, or four main things that you could consider as part of the means of production. It would be like intellectual property of some sort, knowledge, machines, land, and labor. Depends what you mean by machines. You could think of machines as factories. Factories could be considered, and machines as part of the same thing. And so the problem with, the problem that socialism is trying to solve is many things, but one of the things that they're trying to solve is inequality, essentially.
Yeah.
Or inequity, depending on what you mean by it. So equality of outcome, or equality of just a sort of more general sense of, well, everybody's equal.
Yeah.
And then within that, there's a bunch of strands of socialism. So communism is socialism based on common ownership of the means of production, and allocation of consumption goods based on need, whatever you mean by need. There's no private property, no classes, no money, and no state in the ideal communism. There's the Fabians, which were non-revolutionary, gradualist, reformist socialists who thought, okay, well, how can we take the current form and create something like social democracy? There's the Marxists, there's the anarcho-communists, there's a whole bunch of variations of this, but they all have in common that they more or less lesser want to abolish private ownership of the means of production and or private property.
Yeah. I guess also because someone I'm sure might disagree with our definitions of these things, because things like socialism and communism particularly are somewhat vaguely defined.
Yeah.
Today, when people say communism, more often than not, they're referring to the final stage of history in the Marxist context, when the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will exist to basically fend off any sort of counter-revolutionary attacks by the bourgeoisie, when that melts away and when you live in a stateless workers' utopia, that's communism. And I think that today is probably the most common definition of communism.
Yeah.
And then set against that, probably the other major strand of communism is anarcho-communism, which rejects this idea that the revolution should institute any sort of state, even if that state, in the Marxist sense, being the dictatorship of the proletariat, exists to prevent a capitalist counter-revolution or a reactionary counter-revolution. Anarcho-communists flat out just don't recognise that a state should exist at all. Or there should be some organised central authority governing things. And this split is really old. Like you had the first International, which Marx was part of in the 19th century, which was where basically a lot of socialists and communists got together and tried to hash out how they would pursue revolution, tried to hash out the theoretical aspects of their movement. There was a huge fracture in it between communists led by Marx, who believed that some sort of state would need to exist post-revolution, at least for a while, to ensure that the gains of the revolution were maintained, and then anarcho-communists, which faction was led in large part by Mikhail Bakunin, who was a Russian anarcho-communist, or anarchist, I guess. I'm not sure if he described himself as an anarcho-communist, because also at that time, anarchist was sort of a dirty word and synonymous with political terrorist or leftist terrorist.
It is kind of still a dirty word, isn't it?
Depends on which circles you move in. But at that time, it was much more closely associated with leftist terrorism, because people espousing somewhat anarchist ideals were assassinating a bunch of political leaders around Europe. Like there were a lot of anarchist terrorists. But yeah, Bakunin disagreed with Marx, particularly in that any sort of state should be set up. And then when Bakunin died, the anarchist movement very ironically, was sort of looking for theoretical leadership, or someone to come in and to spell out the theoretical underpinnings of the anarchism that Bakunin espoused, because he was less concerned with offering a theoretical framework. He was much more interested in the propaganda of the deed. And that's where Kropotkin came in. When Kropotkin moved to London, having been imprisoned and chased out of a bunch of continental European countries, he moved to London, started writing, or continued to write, and was embraced as a theoretician of anarcho-communism.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, so he filled that vacuum left by Bakunin.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That actually makes a lot more sense.
Which almost
how he's writing
suggests that people naturally look for leaders.
Well, my understanding of... Well, that's a good point. We should actually talk a little bit about...
Yeah. No, that was a cheap shot. No, that was pretty unfair, actually. And that's not reflective of...
Zing!
Of anarchism.
Jack comes in.
It's not that. It was a pretty stupid comment to make. Because basically, maybe actually defining anarchism in this context would be useful, because it's not that they say that there should be no authority, or that any authority is de facto bad. Well, maybe some anarchists say that, but on the whole, it's a disagreement with the idea that you need an organised, centralised, coercive authority. And I think this recognition is in large part true. So we've both read Hayek, and it's not an insight limited to more left-leaning philosophers and political adherents. This idea that a significant degree of human action is non-state mediated or not mediated by authorities. For example, what we're doing with this podcast now, we don't agree to do certain things for this podcast. For example, we don't agree to read certain books for given episodes using state-backed legal instruments that we agree between
No, Jack just
ourselves.
actually hands me a subpoena each week and says, you will read this.
If you don't do this, I'm going to take you to court. That doesn't happen. So at this very small scale, we self-organize without the state intermediating between us. And that insight is what I think left anarchists and right anarchists both get right, that there's a huge, I'd say the majority of human interactions exist independently of the state.
And that applies at all different scales. That can apply at the scale of a family. They'll have leaders. Sorry, one tick.
Yeah, it's not that anarchists necessarily disagree with any sort of authority. It's more with how do you formalize that authority? So, for example, with Kropotkin writing about the theoretical underpinnings for anarchism, I doubt that he would have a philosophical problem with the fact that he's offering these ideas and that certain people like those ideas and will propagate those ideas. And as such, Kropotkin occupies some sort of prestige associated with his name because of his ideas. I don't think many anarchists would disagree with that self-organizing capacity. Where they start to disagree is if you were to say, therefore Kropotkin should have coercive power over others, and we need to organize some sort of coercive apparatus to perpetuate his this prestige associated with his name. I'm trying to make amends for that thoughtless throwaway comment. That was unfair.
Sorry, I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by a capitalist pig coming in asking for the keys to my scooter so they could perform repairs on the scooter. Bastards. It's my scooter now. No, very nice capitalists. What did I miss? You spoke about.
So you were saying that even within family units, for example, there might be members of the family who carry greater authority than others.
You have hierarchy. It's if I had to put in the language of libertarian thinking, which has, depending on how far you take the libertarianism, blends into anarchism, it's just saying, well, there's a particular institution, the state, or collection of institutions that have a monopoly on the use of violence and coercion. And at least the anarchists that I've read don't ever disagree with, well, you can have leaders, you can have communal leaders, family leaders, and potentially, even if an entire group of people in the order of millions of people wanted to consensually agree to have some sort of government, that as long as it's not essentially be monopolizing violence and then using that violence to coercively enforce its point of view on everybody else, that there's always an opt-out or whatever, that could still be considered anarchistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just... I think there's some sort of misconception that anarchism is just it's just the wild, wild west out here, baby, and you can just run around killing people and there's no consequences. Look, I guarantee there were consequences for running around killing people in the wild, wild west.
yeah, absolutely.
So... yeah, that's kind of surface level. I guess whenever I've heard somebody criticize anarchism on those grounds, it immediately indicates to me that they've never actually taken the time to go and read any anarchist thinking.
There is a caricature of anarchism that exists that is much more frivolous than at least the anarchism that I've read. And the Conquest of Bread. The Conquest of Bread is not nearly as frivolous as this rude caricature of anarchism that's sort of a meme in our society would have you believe.
I assume that's just people just not reading it.
Yeah, probably, which is why we're here. We read it and regurgitate it into your mouths like a bird.
We're filling in this hole in your life where you go and take the time to actually read and think about something, and instead you take mine and Jack's thoughts, and you just
Yeah.
replicate
We will
those.
completely misrepresent it to you. Peter Kropotkin was all about an absolute state which exists for the sole purpose of keeping the NASDAQ as high as possible.
Yeah.
That's what this entire book's about. He predicted the NASDAQ by quite a long way. He was way ahead of his time.
Nice.
Yeah, it's mostly about Dogecoin, leveraged Dogecoin trading.
And an interesting point is that my perspective is that as the world becomes more networked and people all over the world can connect with one another spontaneously at very low cost, the marginal cost of connecting with other people is essentially zero.
Yeah. It's getting so low as to be quite trivial in a lot of cases.
And so it almost seems to me as though this anarchistic stuff is just ramped up to, well, infinity almost with the internet. For example, the people on our Discord, complete anarchy. But the fact that you have a platform like Discord, firstly, they didn't ask anybody's permission to create that platform, and then they've made it. And something like Discord has something like 200 million users, something like that. And those are all small internet communities, people spontaneously self-organizing and having these interactions. And we're not even talking about technologies like Nostr and Bitcoin yet, which just facilitate even more non-state mediated peer-to-peer interactions. Like behind.
We hold the power of the pen.
Jack and I are the kings on the Discord server, and we are jealous.
Don't let anybody in the server get ideas.
We are jealous kings. So, yeah, it's interesting. So I don't know what this role of the state is 1,000 years from now, if there will be states and that sort of thing. But certainly
It's going to be Discord servers.
It's just going to be Discord servers.
The Discordization
of the entire world. Oh, God, that does sound dystopian. But it does seem as though, Hayek called it the emergent order, which I think is a very descriptive way of saying it. You have spontaneous social order of different forms, families, communities, so forth, interacting with one another at different levels. So like different organizations interacting with one another, or different individuals interacting with one another, creates an emergent social order. As the population becomes bigger and more interconnected, that emergent social order seems to just dominate how much of an influence we have on one another's life compared to how much influence the state has on our lives proportionally, depending on, obviously, where you live in the world.
Yeah, where you live in the world, and also the technological environment within which you live, because...
So this doesn't apply to North Koreans.
The state is itself a piece of social technology that has been very, very effective in organising people, particularly for war. So it's
pretty good for that.
An effective social technology for dominating your neighbours, because it, particularly post-French Revolution, when they started really trying to format the people within the geographic area controlled by a particular state, using things like a common language, using standardized education to try to inculcate a shared set of values, it allows you to mobilize a large number of soldiers in a fairly organized way to dominate your neighbors. So the state is not arbitrary. Like, it is a technology that exists and is competitive for a reason, but we'll go over the reasons why Kropotkin still doesn't like it. Because he disagrees with that both on a moral level, in that he doesn't think that people should have that sort of authority, and also on a practical level, in that he thinks, or thought, it's probably not still thinking, he is dead, he thought that anarchist or self-organizing groups of people would actually have a technological advantage and a production advantage when compared to people who are organized from the top down.
And Jack, could I rewind like 30 seconds? You used a particular word in a kind of strange way that I asked you about a number of weeks ago in an offline conversation. You said, if the state formats people. I loved it when you used that word. Can you explain what you mean? This is a Jackism, people getting formatted.
I mean it in the sense that, okay, so if we're going to lean into the formatting analogy, the computer science analogy, so people all have more or less the same hardware. Like there'll be some variations in people's bodies, but comparing two humans and then comparing a human to a non-human animal or to a rock, like human bodies are pretty similar. But the software people are running can be radically different. And so in the case of, so suppose you have a geographic area. I mentioned the French Revolution. So pre-French Revolution, what we think of as French today was effectively what they spoke in Paris and the surrounding area. And people throughout the rest of the country spoke different languages. So they were running different software in that respect. And post-French Revolution, there was a concerted effort to make everyone within the geographic and political entity that we call France speak Parisian French, or just the Parisian language. So reformat them so that they can all understand each other and understand things communicated by the state in that particular language. So using that particular software such that they're easier to organize. So that's an example of how you can be formatted by a state.
So good. I love that. Formatting people. Format yourself.
Just rewrite them.
LSD is really good for defragging. If your operating system's a bit like slow, a bit clunky, just
you shake up the snow globe.
Just defrag it with some psychedelics.
That's the way to do it. You just take enough that you stop being able to speak whatever language your particular state wants you to speak.
Just start speaking in tongues.
This is true freedom. Not being able to operate within the state environment.
Not being able to operate within your couch.
Not having enough shared pieces of software. Well, it's even things like social mores is another area that, to a large extent, I don't think it's state imposed. I think this is much more spontaneous order. Like in Australia, how people from mainland China and Australia, like when they're like freshly in Australia, will just like spit on the ground because it's pretty normal in a lot of China. But in Australia, that's not cool to be like sitting outside a cafe and just keep spitting on the street in front of people.
Yeah.
But pretty quickly they learn that that's not socially acceptable. Like there's a self-organizing social code that they get formatted to fairly quickly. So it doesn't have to be state mediated.
Yeah. Hey, Jack. What do you call a well-adjusted eel with lots of friends?
Well-adjusted eel with lots of friends?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
A social more. Insert
for people
dad joke
who aren't aware or don't know enough about Australian marine biology. A moray eel is a type of eel in Australia.
Tropical. There's lots of eels. I saw eels last night. I went on a night dive.
Oh, they're terrifying. They have these giant needle-like teeth.
Yeah, no, they're really cute. I really like them. They're
not cute.
They're really placid. They don't come, like they won't come, but they'll stick their little head out and they'll have that dumb fucking look on their face. So good. I love them. Anyways, yes, fish jokes are on top of mind at the moment with all the diving.
Levi's doing lots of diving.
I got down to, I didn't tell you, I got down to 27 meters the other day in one of my free dives. It was cool.
Oh, free dive?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
And so I was actually getting to the point where you can drop, like you free fall. Once you go negatively buoyant, you free fall to you're free falling underwater. It's really fucking cool. Yeah.
Does that making swimming back up to the surface way harder?
Yeah, well, it's pushing you down. That's why you're free falling. So if you want to come back to the surface, you've got to kick against the negative buoyancy.
Yeah, I might not do that.
Anyways, I've derailed the conversation about anarcho-communism with
That's very unusual for
my shitty eel joke.
What were we even talking about?
I don't know. Should we just get straight more into Kropotkin though?
Yeah,
we've got some major concepts that he talks about.
Yeah, and when we discuss the major concepts, we can talk about how those compare to Marxism, but also to other forms of anarcho-communism. Because he disagreed with other luminaries of the left anarchist movement like Bakunin. And then Anarcho-syndicalism wasn't so much a thing when Kropotkin was around, but that's been an evolution of a branch of anarchism. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the two major concepts that we should talk about first are either or / probably both interwoven. The wage labour system, why it's bad and how to abolish it, and the concept of expropriation. So they're closely related. What do you reckon we should touch on first?
Maybe a tiny, or just a bit of context, because what he was talking about was he saw that workers, particularly the urban working class, in the various European countries he was in, were immiserated, and conditions for them were getting worse. They were getting paid less and less, in part because of exposure to basically productive working groups in other European countries, which would drive down the amount of money they could demand in return for their services, and also in response to mechanization. So some artisans were suddenly getting paid less and less, or could demand less money for their wares, because you now had machines that could automate what they did, or make it so that someone with minimal training could output fairly similar things to what an artisan with extensive training could do. They were having to work longer hours. Work was their working conditions were precarious. Like, they could lose their job in a day. A lot of them were starving, living in disease-ridden, cramped apartment blocks. It was really horrible.
If you've ever heard the word Luddites, the Luddites refer to textile workers who went and smashed up factories and stuff. Because of this issue in the early 19th century.
Yeah. And so Kropotkin looked at this and tried to work out why it was happening and how you could prevent this from happening. So it's why, as you were saying earlier, how you don't agree with this, but you take it seriously. Similarly, I ultimately don't agree with his prescriptions or suggestions for what should happen, but he's not being malicious. He's trying to solve real problems. Yeah, he saw these problems, and he decided that the root cause of these is the existence of private property. And
private property and the state.
A related concept to private property is the wage system. So people getting paid or being able to demand payment for their labour. And the way that you get around this is expropriation. I guess this comes to this idea of revolution. So he supported revolution against the current capitalist order, but said that there could be many types of revolution, but only really one type of revolution, the anarcho-communist revolution, could succeed. And a component of this would be expropriation of everything. People wouldn't own anything. So housing, you would expropriate it and distribute it to people on the basis of need. Food, you would expropriate it, distribute it to people on the basis of need. Clothing, he said that you could expropriate clothing, but it was better probably just to expropriate the means of producing clothes and make people clothes and distribute the new clothes, because no one wants old clothes.
Well, he was wrong about that. I mean, you just got to go to an op shop in like San Francisco or Melbourne or whatever, or Berlin, I assume, is just full of op shops. People love used clothing.
Yeah, it's a narrow band of people think it's fashionable to wear beaten up used clothing. Most people want newer clothes. It's not going to buy them any social prestige to be wearing a fucking tea cozy as a beanie.
To be an upper middle
whatever
class,
weird shit people in Fitzroy wear.
Upper middle class kid in Melbourne or Sydney pretending to be poor.
Yeah. The Kropotkin chic. Yeah, so expropriation. It was one of the necessary conditions for a successful revolution, according to Kropotkin, where you take everything. And when I say take everything, I don't mean that there's this central body, not like a disciplined Marxist revolutionary party, which decides what to take, who you're taking things from, to whom these things go. He said that basically, when the revolution happens, you're going to have groups of people self-organize to start taking inventories of housing or inventories of food in their local area. And then they're going to, again, spontaneously start distributing these things to people in their local area on the basis of what people need. This is one of the places where I take him less seriously because I just don't know why people wouldn't just start taking things for themselves.
And why there wouldn't be any resistance.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing.
It's like you have
people start shooting.
He calls them bands of volunteers, would just start expropriating.
It just sounds like bandits.
So gangs will just pop up and start saying that they're volunteers and saying that they're expropriating the means of production in order to quote unquote redistribute it to the more needy.
Yeah, it's like someone expropriating TVs from a Kmart during a riot.
Or, a whole bunch of people expropriating kicks from Culture Kings in downtown LA or something like. It's just, you can call yourself a revolutionary, but you're actually just a thug.
Yeah, and this brings up one of the areas where I got quite irritated with Kropotkin, because we've seen this form of argumentation many times, and I've pointed it out in a number of episodes where I'm pretty sure one of his responses to that would be, well, you've grown up in a capitalist environment, which means that you couldn't possibly conceive of how noble and selfless the working classes are. And the reason why you think that this wouldn't work is because you are not, because you're a capitalist, because you're not an anarchist. And it's this form of argumentation which basically says you can only validly critique or understand what I am saying if you already agree with me.
Yeah, it's the dismissal of somebody that disagrees with you as saying they don't understand you. It's like, well, maybe I do understand what you're saying, but I just think you're wrong.
Yeah. So I get irritated when people argue like that. And we've seen this form of argumentation all over the place.
Yeah. I've probably been guilty of it as well, like at times.
I think we all have. You
pretty easy to
need to try to be self-aware.
But I haven't written a 200-page manifesto based on that entire premise. So I could. Why you should why you should genuflect to Levi as Emperor King of the world.
Yeah, genuflect. I like that.
Yeah,
a lot.
You like that one.
Yeah, nice. That's very important. It's genuflection, not election.
So he has this kind of hand wave. One of my issues with Kropotkin, all right, we've done too much context setting and fucking all this sort of crap. We're going to start let's get into it and critiquing. And
how long have we been recording for? Only an hour. Yeah, good. And it only took us an hour
to get to this point. Okay, intermixing explanation with critique. One of the things that he does is like, okay, there'll be these bands or volunteers will spontaneously emerge in the towns and will expropriate non-violently somehow the means of production from the capitalists and from the property owners and house owners and so forth. And then they will fairly and justly, out of their own rationality and goodness of their heart, distribute the wares and the properly reappropriated goods to all the members of the community based on their need. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. There's a lot of hand waving. There's one of the first bits of hand waving is like, well, why will these people start voluntarily associating and forming these bands? 2, why will there not be any resistance? How will they overcome the resistance? 3 would be like, what is a need? What is like who's more needy than another person of like a particular say room or house or piece of food? And then why does one person get to decide who's more needy than another, or how does the collective make that decision together? He doesn't answer any of these sorts of like actual questions of. He just sort of says extremely vaguely that this will happen, and because people are really smart and good and stuff, and if you've ever seen the workers, you would know how amazing they are, that they will be able to do this and they'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah, it does. It seems to me to be this train of thought that quite easily falls into might makes right. In that, suppose you have someone who you have a few different groups who want, I don't know, one house, suppose. Because the way that Kropotkin says you can assess need is basically someone says, I want this. And in parts of this book, he'll disagree with people like, for example, Bakunin believed that people should receive from some sort of anarchist society resources proportionate to the amount of work they do, whereas Kropotkin disagreed and said, no, people should receive what they say they want. But you run into the problem where suppose two people both say, I want this house, and neither are amenable to mediation. The determinant of who gets that house is ultimately going to be who can muster more coercive power, whether that's in terms of violent coercive power, so you can get a mob behind you to say, no, this person is going to have that house, or social coercive power. So within the self-organizing anarchist commune, you get enough people putting pressure on one party to basically relinquish their claim to that house in favor of the other party. It boils down to might makes right very easily.
And to get out of this, his solution is just that. He just asserts that, well,
they won't.
That's essentially what they won't.
Like this is one of the weakest parts of the book. Is in response to really difficult questions, he basically just says, "Well, no, it's not going to happen."
Yeah, and his very loose reasoning, if you can call it that, is he says something. There's this one point in the book. I don't want to dig through the quotes. There's a lot of quotes, but essentially he says it a few times. Roughly, he says, if you've ever seen the workers, the way that or the serfs, or the former serfs, interacting with one another and their sense of justice and how they treat one another with kindness and fairness, you will know that when these roaming bands of volunteers spontaneously
start taking PS5s for themselves.
start stealing expropriating other people's property, that they will just, out of a sense of justice and fairness and rationality, just know what the moral decisions are. And that's kind of where he leaves it. He just asserts that that's the case. And then it's just like, okay, on the assumption that people just... And of course, he's assuming that other people's sense of higher morality in the future anarcho-communist revolution, that they will agree with his sense of justice and morality. Yeah. And therefore they will be right. It's like, of course, but if they don't do what he thinks, what if they think, oh, well, yes, this person with disabilities needs this thing, except we don't really want to have a community with people with disabilities, so we're just going to kill all the people with disabilities, and then we don't have to worry about that, and then we'll have more stuff to share.
Yeah, or not feed them.
Or not feed them. Was like, no, well, that wouldn't happen because that isn't something that Kropotkin would agree with. So no, that is not what they would do.
Yeah. That's definitely one of the weakest parts of this book. And also with anarchism on the whole, in my experience, fairly admittedly limited experience of reading other anarchist books in addition to this one, that real resistance to being prescriptive with reference to many things, like how the revolution should be carried out, what sort of society is going to exist post-revolution, how people should mediate disputes, etc., means that very often they fall back on hand-waving and saying, oh, it'll work itself out. I don't want to be prescriptive.
So can we Kropotkin bot this? can we? I am Kropotkin bot.
Well, the Kropotkin bot position would be, in part, people self-organize in so many areas and resolve disputes in so many areas. And probably the majority of disputes between people are resolved independently of the state in what is effectively an anarchist way. Then why couldn't you solve these problems too? I guess it's really hard to say what it truly means to be making decisions or resolving disputes independently of the state within a state apparatus, given that you do make these decisions or resolve disputes with the background knowledge that there exists a court system, there exists a coercive apparatus in the form of the police or ultimately the military to prevent random violence or petty acts of violence.
Yeah.
It's still taking place within the context of a coercive apparatus which can be called upon.
So there's also another Kropotkin bot response that I can think of, which would be something
Yeah,
something along Kropotkin bot 3000 says, ChatGPT 4 says, oh wait, we should have gotten ChatGPT to take on ChatGPT 4 to pretend to be Peter Kropotkin.
Tell it to be Peter Kropotkin.
And reply to our responses. Anyways, I'm going to take on the role of ChatGPT. And ChatGPT would say through Levi that, and this is kind of a Marxist-y answer, but potentially Kropotkin would actually say something along these lines. Well, you're only thinking that way because within the ideological superstructure of capitalism, you think that people would have these sorts of, wouldn't be able to have these sorts of amiable disagreements and dispute resolution. But within a different ideological superstructure, one based on communality and, you know, free working people, that they actually would be able to, because the actual, so to speak, the ideological superstructure, the culture, the social norms and so forth, coming out of a fundamentally different economic base of no private property, communally shared means of production, people will act differently. And people will be able to rationally and justly resolve these disputes in a fair and equitable way without resolving it into violence. But you haven't seen that.
Kropotkin bot position, because in some ways that could be used to justify Marxist communism, which Kropotkin disagreed with, because presumably the revolution will be taking place among a population of people who have grown up in and lived in a capitalist system of social relations and of economic relations. So in that case, having a stage of the revolution, of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where you have people you have a disciplined party in control who understand what the goal is and basically sit there as an organization to guide people through the process of learning these social relations. I think that Kropotkin bot position almost justifies a Marxist communism rather than an anarcho-communism.
Yeah, so that was extremely Marxist, what I just said, but I was trying to bend it to be more less statey and just say that, okay, well, you don't need a state to do it. Like these communes around, like these small communes will sort of have their own, so to speak, like local ideological superstructures, and they'll figure it out.
What about the wage system? We talk about that. He doesn't like wages. I guess we already touched on it in that when he says you shouldn't have private property and people should receive from the anarchist, I guess you call it a commune, the anarchist association of people, what they want. Their claim on resources is to want something. He calls it need, but which is, I guess, the positively valenced way of putting it.
Need, want, desire.
In his definition of need, it's inseparable from want. And his argument against people just making completely outrageous claims on the anarchist organization is basically, well, they just won't. Yeah. Which I don't really buy.
People will naturally just become more austere in their tastes for some unknown reason.
Yeah. But instead of the wage system where people get resources, whether they're financial resources or their food or shelter or other sorts of payment in kind for their work, instead of that, you instead have want. And if you want something and say, okay, I want this much food and I want these types of food, that's what you receive. And that's what the abolition of the wage system looks like. And he wants the wage system abolished in large part because it allows for exploitation. So the capitalists who own factories, for example, keep workers immiserated so that the workers will accept low wages so that the capitalists can skim off a greater amount of surplus value from the labour. And the entire wage system encourages keeping people immiserated, whereas if you don't have wages, then I guess that motive isn't there.
And he levies this criticism of what he calls collectivism. So I think broadly what he means by collectivism is Marxism or some sort of state-based socialism that still maintains that you might have money and wages. It's just that the wages and the means of production come from a state ownership of some sort.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's his
And
his problem with it.
that charge isn't just leveled against Marxists. It's also leveled against other anarchists like Bakunin,
Yeah.
who felt that there should be some sort of... He didn't call it wages. He said you would receive from the anarchist organisation food and shelter and things in proportion to how much you contribute in terms of your labour. But Kropotkin says that's effectively wage labour.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the
different.
centralised anarchist organisation is not a state.
Yeah. That's why I keep not saying like the country or the state or something. You're just calling it an organisation. And I mean that loosely because it's not going to be formally organised.
The flat, non-hierarchical organisation that definitely doesn't have a monopoly on violence and is not a state is...
Yeah, it's the Occupy Wall Street commune. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think for this one, let's go back a little bit into a little bit more historical context, especially with the development of economic thought. So basically, Adam Smith comes out with The Wealth of Nations, probably one of the most important books in modern human history. And because it's the founding book of economics, essentially, notwithstanding some stuff that, say, Aristotle or some other thinkers said beforehand. But the question being, there's scarce resources. How are those scarce resources allocated and divided and distributed amongst the population? And how is wealth created?
Probably scarce resources with alternative uses as well, because the alternative use dimension is really important and makes it so much more complicated.
Yeah, and then like a population with a whole bunch of varying things that they want to do with who have alternative uses or wants. And so one of the interesting things that Smith did, Smith, super important, one of the most important thinkers if you're interested in understanding the way the world works. And he, importantly, he was struggling with this question of, I think of it as a tripartite problem. The three parts of the problem are what is value, what is price, what is cost. Those three related things, we know that they're somehow related. So you could say, from whence does something on the market acquire the particular price that it has? And Smith's answer, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but essentially Smith proposed what is called the labour theory of prices, which is to say that essentially...
which I think is from Ricardo.
Yeah, Ricardo. I would generalize it more to say the input theory of the input theory of value or price, the input theory of value and prices, which is to say that you have some stuff that goes into it and essentially into creating anything. And say you're trading A for B. Well, if B is the money price of A, then you would think that, okay, the price is roughly corresponding to the inputs into the production process. And there's a whole bunch of issues with that, which have been basically fixed by later economists. But in particular, Marx innovated on what Smith said, and he honed in not just on all the inputs, factory, land, labour, and he said, well, actually, if you go back further enough in the causal chain, every factory was built by labour, and any piece of land, in order to be turned into a productive piece of land, not just like some dirt sitting around doing nothing, it has to be tilled and so forth, and fertilised and so forth. So really, if you go back far enough in the causal chain, you'll get to labour, which I think is a really interesting insight. And obviously, I'm not a Marxist, but he is a very interesting thought experiment he did. And so he said, well, actually, everything just boils back down to labour. And Marx had this, and this will become relevant in a tick when we get back to Kropotkin. Marx had this idea, if I remember correctly, from Das Kapital. He said, there's this thing, I think he called it value substance. You've read Capital, right, Jack? Is that what he called it? Value substance? Yeah, the value substance?
I don't remember his precise terminology because I read Capital quite a while ago, probably about 10 years ago.
He's literally saying that somehow the labor that goes into, say, any production process sort of I don't want to be magical in my, like, to me it sounds like he's basically having magical thinking, but like somehow the labor that goes into a productive process puts this thing, value substance, into the final end product. And so when you sell, and the price basically corresponds to the value substance in the final product. And in particular, what Marx came up with was a scheme of saying, like, well, if I've produced X amount of value, as indicated by the price on the market that actually is fetched on the market when the goods are sold, and say I've contributed to creating 100 chairs and they each sell for $10 each. So the value of my labor corresponds to $1,000 worth of chairs, but I'm only paid $200. Then where did that excess value get allocated to? Well, it got allocated to the capital owner, the person who paid my wages to undertake that labor. But notwithstanding that they might have provided the factory or whatever, or the other goods for me to make the chairs, they skimmed some amount. If you like, maybe $100 got spent on the wood and $100 on maintaining the factory, then there's some amount left over that they skimmed off the top. And that there is the basis of Marxist thinking on all capitalism, all profit-seeking capitalism. The wage system in general is inherently exploitative, because at the end of the day, the capital owner is taking a profit, and that profit should have been actually the workers.
Yeah, there's
I probably butchered that, sorry, but that's my rough understanding at lib.
Yeah, that sounds fair. And it's a problem I have with Marxism, that oftentimes there's not much value, or sometimes no value, attached to risk and organization.
Zero.
So in terms taking a risk in building something new, which isn't free, and also the value of organization. So yes, you can have workers working. I guess an anarchist like Kropotkin would say the workers could self-organize, but oftentimes there is a real benefit to having someone or a group of people taking the time to organize and set out some sort of organizational principles for how a group of workers will work together, which can increase output, and which isn't, again, free, but which is not counted as labor by some communists.
Yeah.
And therefore isn't seen as contributing value or adding value.
The communists don't take into account taking on risks. They don't take into account the value of managerial labor, and they don't take into account the value of, or I don't like that word, the role. I won't say the value, I'll say the role of. They basically say the role of managerial, the role of managerial labor is negligible compared to the actual, say, factory work, and the role of entrepreneurial judgment.
In this context, saying value is probably useful, because the idea of surplus value comes about in part by looking at what the theoretical value of the labor you put in is versus the sale price
and
of some good, and then saying, well, where is the additional value coming from? It's not there, and therefore the price must reflect some sort of exploitation. Whereas in that context, I'd be inclined to say, well, there is additional value provided by organization and risk.
Yeah, and so the reason why I shy away from using that word is because it's kind of overloaded. And now I've sharpened the way that I think about this tripartite problem, the price value cost problem, to the point where I use the word value in my own thinking in a very specific way. Whereas, like, to me, the way that Marx and even Smith and a lot of people, if you just have a casual conversation with somebody about, like, well, the house value, like getting a house valuated on the Melbourne property market or something, like, it's used in a very, like, loose way, but you can actually sharpen it up quite a lot. But anyway, so that's the historical background, and basically Kropotkin, even though he disagrees with Marx on some things, he does use Marx's labor theory of value to justify or to explain why the wage system needs to be abolished. And building on that exploitation in the wage system, he actually then goes a step further and says, well, one of the key issues here is actually money in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
So should we talk about money?
Yeah. This is one of the subjects that you often shy away from, but I think
I don't
you're
really
going to
like
have to talk about money
talking
here.
about it. It's not. Look, if you twist my arm, I guess I can. I suppose it's relevant to the episode, so probably should.
Bitcoin.
Yeah. This is why I like Kropotkin, like, man after my own heart. He does notice that, like, hey, these fucking paper bits of money, like the peasants wanted gold and the fucking goddamn Parisian central government tried to give them bits of paper. Like, I was like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, he does not like fiat currency. He
doesn't like it.
Yeah, it's with Kropotkin, like there are plenty of places where I don't disagree with him. It's just part of why this has been a really fun book to read. Yeah,
so it's interesting because again, historical empathy and all this sort of stuff. So let me look at my historical notes. I wrote down one of the most important books in all of economics is this book called Principles of Economics by Karl Menger, who was the founding father of the Austrian School of Economics. And largely speaking, the Austrian school is considered a heterodox school of economics, and even their greatest, most acclaimed, from mainstream perspective, Hayek, who was probably an Austrian economist.
He doesn't fit neatly.
Like, he's an interesting thinker.
Into the Austrian, because I always felt he's much more empirical than a lot of the other Austrians, but this is also not.
But essentially, like, all the others, like Mises, Menger, now, like Hopper and stuff, are kind of considered a heterodox school. But Karl Menger was published his Principles of Economics in 1871, and this book was written in 1892. Now, notwithstanding that probably cultural evolution and transmission of ideas was slower in the 18th century because they didn't have the internet and that sort of thing. And presumably, I can only assume that maybe Kropotkin was reading non-Austrian economics, so like the British school and potentially like the French writers on economics he was probably reading.
Hadn't gone to Hustlers University.
Hadn't heard of Andrew Tate and become a Giga Chad. So I kind of don't want to like criticize him too much, but at the same time I'm thinking like, you know, this would be more of a general criticism of like thinkers in general over the last like 150 years in economics, is they've essentially ignored Menger's breakthrough. Yeah, Menger's is one of the most important thinkers in like
give us the breakthrough.
Western civilization. So he figured out he solved this problem of the value cost price trilemma. And the trilemma is like, where does something get its price from? What is the true cost of something? What does it mean to value something? He realized, as it's called Austrian economics, but I think the proper word, well, to be in my honest opinion, the proper thing to call Austrian economics is just to call it economics. It is just proper economics. But okay, well, if I wasn't being
beginning to get a feel for
if I wasn't being such a stubborn person about it, I'd say, well, you could call it the subjectivist school of economics, as opposed to the objectivist school of economics, and not objectivism with the Ayn Rand sense. What I mean is, with regards to value, the word value, the Austrians basically say all value is subjective. Yes, the input input into something is an objective fact, like it cost you 10 bushels of wheat to create this bread or whatever, and that is objective. But the key thing that they like go on and on and on and on about is they say all value is subjective. Now, what is
like to concretize that? They're basically saying something is worth what someone will pay
in the moment. And so the price of something, so okay, value is not a thing. You could think of it properly understood, it's really a process. It's an ongoing process and it's a verb. So each individual person is evaluating or valuing things in their environment, and they're making trade-offs and decisions about whether or not they're willing to give up something in their possession to give something else, to get something else. And so the price of something is what is actually required to get that thing that you have to give up. So a good example is like if a book costs $10, if a book is priced at $10 and I pay $10 for that book, what I'm saying is I value the book more than I value the $10, and the shopkeeper is saying they value the $10 more than they value the book. And so he resolved this issue of like, actually, you can have an objective price at the moment of a transaction that says the price of that book was $10 and the price of the $10 was that book. And the book is more valuable than the $10 from the perspective of the person purchasing the book, and vice versa for the person selling the book. And so because of this, you actually have value, which is subjective. You have price, which is what was given up at the moment of the transaction by the transacting parties. And you have cost. And cost really should be thought of as opportunity cost. So you might have given up $10 to buy the book. However, that wasn't what the book cost you. The book cost you all of the things that you could have done, the alternative uses of that $10. So I could have bought a sandwich with the $10. I could have bought more mobile credit with the $10. I could have bought an OnlyFans subscription for $10. And I actually gave up all of those things in order to get the book, but the price was $10. Like, does that make sense? So there's actually...
As a better example, how about we use a theoretical book club podcast and a Patreon account? Yeah, no, that's a good thing to consider, because also it's an obvious corollary of what you're saying, but it is really important that value or cost or price, all these things in this context are not static.
No,
they change based on on the moment and what someone's needs or desires and means in that moment are.
And so they put it like this: the water diamond paradox, which is what Menger resolved in the Principles of Economics by making this distinction between price, cost, and value. And the water diamond paradox is just, if water's absolutely necessary for life, you don't drink it, you'll die, but diamonds are not valuable for life, why do diamonds cost more, or why do they fetch a high price on the market? And Menger basically said, well, they're not more or less valuable because value is in the eyes of the beholder. And in the context of somebody who has access to clean drinking water for next to no marginal cost, say like a person living in a metropolitan city in a developed country, water is abundant and essentially free. And so they're not going to value the next marginal unit of water, but they might value the next marginal unit of some diamonds they could buy because they want to create a wet ring or something.
They look nice,
or they're hedging against inflation or some shit like that. But
it's the first thing you think.
Well, I don't value diamonds, so I have to try to think from other people's point of view. But in a desert, if somebody's dying of thirst and they have a chest of diamonds on them that they've just dug out of the ground, and then they're like, you come up to them and you say, okay, well, I've got 3 liters of water here. This will get you to the next town, but in return for this 3 liters of water, I want your entire chest of diamonds. And if they don't take the trade, they're going to die.
My kingdom for kind of thing.
What are they going to say?
You tell them I'm all about that ice. They can keep that water for themselves.
They just bare their grills at you.
Yeah, bury me with my ice.
And so
I don't care if
that person is going to make that trade, hypothetically. So there's 2 important breakthroughs. The value is subjective. And the other thing is the marginal analysis, which mainstream economists actually did pick up on. And marginal analysis is basically saying you never actually make a decision about what you would do with all water supply and all diamond supply. Decisions are only ever made at the margin. You only think about the next unit of the good that you're going to purchase or sell. And so because of these 2 things together, Menger's like unbelievably important. And his insights, I think, have essentially been ignored for the last 150 years. And it's only the Austrians, the hardcore libertarians, and now the Bitcoiners who have taken those insights on board. And whether or not it's just ignorance, and just like Kropotkin and the other socialists and stuff throughout the late 19th century and the 20th century just didn't know about these things, which I think is probably unlikely. Or, a lot of the times they just dismissed economists as just like talking heads for the bourgeois. So, yeah, they ignore this. And that's one of the key things that makes Kropotkin's thinking just completely fucked. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, I won't say it's completely fucked. I'd say his ability to identify problems is good, and he identifies things that are still relevant today, but his proposed solutions, I think, often leave a bit to be desired, in large part because they're just so nebulously defined.
Yeah, sorry. By completely fucked, I was referring specifically, not with regards to identifying like some social problems and stuff. Okay. Sorry, that was a little bit... Sorry, I was on a roll there. What I meant is with regards to things like the wage system.
Let's make more precise what's completely fucked.
Okay, so in particular what I'm referring to is when he talks about things like, the community, the roving bands of thugs / volunteer saints will be able to expropriate some property and then reallocate the output of the capital or whatever that's been expropriated. That they'll do it based on people's needs in some nebulous sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because of his not understanding...
Well, they might do it based on needs, but probably their own.
Their own needs, or what the money system allows... the use of a medium of exchange as a technology for indirect exchange, and the price system that emerges out of that money as a consequence of using it as a unit of account. What that does is it allows everybody in a decentralized manner to make their own local decisions about what trade-offs they're willing to make. And they do that by performing economic calculation, using the prices on the market. So I might think, well, I really want 4 litres of milk, but I really only have enough money for 3 litres of milk. So I'm going to buy that and use the leftover money to buy some Wheat Bix or something. That entire coordination is done through the price system. And it enables basically like scalably billions of people to coordinate their own local actions in response to the minimal amount of economic information they need transmitted via the price system. And because of that, he doesn't understand that. And this is why I think historical empathy, like it was Hayek and Mises who really crystallized this in the mid-20th century. He didn't have that. He didn't realize that like when you abolish money and the price system subsequently, you actually completely destroy decentralized decision-making and trade-offs to be made at this abstract level. Like this is literally the technology that allows the decentralization of resource allocation and decision-making.
Yeah, it's good that you brought that up because that was actually one of the things that he has identified correctly, but then fallen down on in terms of the solutions he proposes is a coordination problem in terms of economics. In that, so for example, when he brings up the question of what does it mean to have an oversupply of food when people are starving? So he says it doesn't make sense that a farmer will produce a certain amount of food, but then won't produce more because it's uneconomical for the farmer, even when someone doesn't have food in that society or within a certain geographic radius of wherever the farmer is farming. He says that doesn't make sense, and that the way to solve it is expropriation and the abolition of private property. To me, he's describing a coordination problem in that there is someone making a good which is desired or needed by someone else, and those two things aren't coordinated.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And yeah, to me, the coordination, because I'm a filthy capitalist who quite likes the Austrian School of Economics, would be to say that, yeah, the problem is that the price signals there aren't being coordinated well enough, and the way of getting those desired and needed goods to the people who want them is also not not as coordinated as it could be.
And to be fair, like, maybe it is in fact the case that the people were so poor that they didn't have the money to buy the things at a price that made sense for the producers. And that is, that does suck. And it sucks when that happens. The problem with Kropotkin that he didn't realize is the thing that fixes that is more capitalism. And in fact, what we're at a point now with such advanced capitalism that, at least according to some people's analyses, there's no longer famine caused by economic or natural causes. Then now we only have famines that are caused by like war or politics, basically, like the government.
Yeah, if you fucking Venezuela.
Yeah, states stepping in and fucking with the price system. But in terms of like the actual output of our productive systems and like the network of distribution and all this sort of stuff, and how just unbelievably cheap a calorie is in many parts of the world, like we don't need, we shouldn't really have poverty anymore, except in the case of when there's war or something like that. And so that has actually been solved by deepening of the market, by broadening of the market and a deepening of specialization and all that sort of stuff. And that's been solved by capitalism. What he didn't realize, so to play not Kropotkin bot, but like kind of devil's advocate on behalf of Kropotkin, this is really fucking complex stuff. Like, this is not.
It is so complex that I would say that a planning body can't plan it because a single body can't possibly know enough. But again, like, I'm definitely showing my ideological slant.
There's three things. If we think back to somebody who lived in the mid to late 19th century, what was the population of the world back then? Like 1 billion people at most. Like, I mean, I could look it up, but I'm not going to because I'm lazy.
Let's keep it at a nice round
1 billion
number.
people. Let's call it 1 billion. Let's call it 1 billion people, because I think it doubled like 3 times last century. So no, it mustn't have done that. Doesn't make any sense. Anyways, let's just call it 1 billion people.
Let's call it X.
Let's call it X.
Let's just take numbers out of
it. He's also writing before Mises, like, basically solved all these problems and completely just exploded communism and socialism. So there's two really hard issues here. One, it's a complex issue, and we're always dealing with our own local information and our own local perspective. And the really big intellectual breakthroughs, part of the reason why they're so insightful, whether it's Hayek or, like in the natural sciences, people make these sorts of breakthroughs, is they're able to look at things more abstractly, and they're able to see past their own local information, or as David Deutsch would say, their own parochialism, and they see something more universal, more abstract. And when we've said all the stuff about like the price system and the coordination of like, actors across the world and all this sort of stuff, that's us taking abstract explanations from thinkers who have already come before us, who actually figured these really complex issues out. And he didn't have that benefit. And he was basically looking at a world that was coming out of the Middle Ages and had lots of injustices and lots of violence. And he was seeing like some people starving and some people living in like manors. And he was saying like, well, this is really unjust, it's really unfair. And also then there's the coordination issue as well. And so that would have, to have some empathy for him, like that would have been essentially like distressing, to say the least, but also confusing and hard to crack as a problem. And so he thought that like, well, this aristocratic class has all this property, and now these capitalists have this means of production, and there's these people starving. So maybe the issue here is those people owning those things and taking it off others.
Yeah, and it's a sort of system which probably takes quite a while to reach some sort of equilibrium, in that if you have a group of people who are entering into the system with far more accumulated wealth than others, that's going to take a long time to start redistributing. And when I say redistributing, I don't mean in a coerced way, but redistributing within.
And the other thing that they were witnessing, which Smith touched on as well, but the Luddites touched on, and like all these people talk about with, like, especially isolationists, who talk about like protecting local economies and stuff, is this idea of creative destruction. And this is one of those really important insights from The Economist, who it's basically the idea that as the market develops and there's innovations, especially innovation basically makes some production processes or some consumer goods essentially redundant. And so it's creative, like innovation is a creative act, but it causes the destruction of some other part of the economy. Not destruction in like setting fire to things, but in terms of like, well, one industry or one part of the economy becomes, less competitive than another part. And in the case...
Well, tying back to what you were saying earlier, you could say that people just aren't willing to pay as much money for those things anymore.
They're being displaced.
Either they can be produced for a much lower price with this new creative method, or something has been created which just supersedes whatever was previously commanding some sort of price.
And so the Luddites and, also like the Marxists and stuff, the early Marxists are kind of grappling with like seeing, say... like these weavers or whatever being put out of work by machines. And that is something that capitalism does. If you let it rip, there'll be more and more innovation and higher forms of productivity. But in that process, whilst we create more productive output in the long term, in the short to intermittent terms, like there'll be local patches of the economy that will turn down.
And this can bring us around actually to the question of innovation under capitalism versus anarchism, because this is something that he spends a lot of time, Kropotkin spends a lot of time in this book talking about, because to his mind, capitalism severely holds back technological innovation. So he was talking about the examples of farming. So he was saying capitalism holds back the adoption of new agricultural methods which could dramatically improve crop yields per unit area of farmland, because capitalism wants to keep workers poor, and a way to do this is by keeping food prices very, very high, or keeping people starving so that they're willing to accept very low wages in return for their labour. Conversely, under an anarchist system, people would innovate, and not only innovate theoretically, but apply innovations in practice for the joy of innovation, and because they would want to improve the output available to an anarchist society such that other people could benefit from these improvements in productive methods and technologies. I think one advantage of capitalism is that it makes things quite competitive and provides quite clear incentives for people to take risks on new technologies and apply them, and in doing so makes technological advancement happen more quickly than if those sorts of incentives weren't as sharp. And it can be sharp to the point where, say, your company will go out of business if you're in some sort of competitive field and one of your competitors comes up with a method to produce whatever you're producing for a lower cost. It's a very, very clear competition, which tends to drive at least a certain portion of people to technologically innovate to get an edge on their competition.
Yeah, so notwithstanding... Sorry, did you want to finish that off?
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I'm just not sure that will be the case if you have an anarchist society where basically those sorts of goods are guaranteed.
Essentially, okay, so I'm going to put aside the fact that this is a bit of the book where he gets a bit hand-wavy again as well. Like, just saying that people will innovate for the joy of it is just like such a... Like, my problem with the hand-wavy stuff is why couldn't I just hand-wave some alternative behavior?
Yeah, well, you could hand-wave in people will become static.
Yeah, or you could hand-wave in, no, people will start innovating in order to just like hurt one another. And because he doesn't provide any real reason, underlying mechanism why people should innovate benevolently other than just because, then why should your opponent say something more productive than that?
Yeah, and that we'll get to it later. He does avoid, basically in all of this book, the problem of violence, and particularly the problem of violence from groups opposed to the anarchist commune.
So
he does refer to it in. So he says, okay, so suppose Paris had an anarchist revolution. he sets out how Paris could become self-sufficient in terms of food, in terms of energy, clothing, housing, even if the peasants surrounding Paris remained reactionary or remained conservative and wouldn't trade with Paris. But he doesn't go into what would happen if those groups tried invading or tried much more forcibly trying to coerce, in this case, the anarchist commune of Paris to give up anarchism.
Yeah. And so with regards to the like innovation stuff, there's two key things that he didn't, under, again, historical empathy, he didn't have these insights available to him. But the two key insights are that one, Mises calls it the calculation problem. And the calculation problem is essentially just like, if you don't have a money system, so what is the price system actually doing? It's communicating the changes in scarcity of all the different things in the economy to everybody locally. It's compressing the information into a single objective output, the price, and that price is being propagated across the entire system very rapidly. But that price system comes from the fact that people are using a medium of exchange to perform their economic calculations. And so if you don't have a medium of exchange to perform your economic calculations, like saying, I'm going to go and buy this many bushels of wheat for this amount of money so that I can go and do this other thing, and I think I can sell it for this amount of money on the market, you actually can't do that coordination. Like, Mises basically, there's a whole chapter on this in Human Action, which basically lays out this entire argument. And to me, it's like the decisive factor why like socialism, or at least any system that abolishes money, it'll just fall into poverty, because the price system is actually helping everybody coordinate their actions. But on top of that, there's this additional element, which is, again, this is a Mises insight. He said the problem of he said capitalism is not a managerial system, it's an entrepreneurial system. And the problem with the socialists is that they thought it was a managerial system. They thought it was all about managing resources and allocating them and reallocating them, and basically keeping account of all the resources and then giving them to people. But it's not a managerial system. Management plays an important role, but it's an entrepreneurial system. And what we mean by entrepreneurial is that people have to make judgments under uncertainty. So every time an entrepreneur gets a business loan or like takes their own capital and goes out to do something, they're at risk of losing that capital. And whether or not it turns out to be a good venture, they have to take on that risk. They might lose their capital, they might get rewarded. But that entrepreneurial judgment, that willingness to like take on the uncertainty of the market, that is completely destroyed when you get rid of money. You can't actually like do that entrepreneurial function except in perhaps an extremely limited like local sense. And so his entire concept of like Kropotkin's entire concept that people will just innovate. Why am I saying this entrepreneurial stuff? Because one of the driving factors of innovation in our economy is entrepreneurs realizing, hey, I could build this new technology. I don't actually know if it'll work, but my judgment says that I think that it'll work. And you get millions of those people doing that. Every now and then somebody figures something out that works. And that's what's driving innovation. Whereas he's just completely removed the technology that enables that from his ideal society.
How about, okay, I'll be Kropotkin bot and approach this from the moral standpoint. So he says that what allows one person to say that this particular thing belongs to them and that they can benefit from its use or charge other people for its use or restrict its use, when not only is that, so I suppose it's a piece of machinery, not only is that piece of machinery the result of the labour, the physical labour of the people who built it, but it's also the result of the mental labour of perhaps the person who thought it up, but also the labour of the people who taught the inventor of that particular thing, and then the people who farmed the food that fed the inventor of that particular thing. And this stretches back on and on and on to the point where this particular machine really becomes the common inheritance of humanity. So even if a system might theoretically function better if it has this capitalist organization, which, well, as we've already alluded to or said explicitly, he thought actually it would function worse if it were capitalist rather than anarchist. But even if it might function better if it's capitalist, ethically it's hard to defend, given that these things are the common inheritance of everyone.
And I think that's a really interesting, like that was actually one of the more interesting parts of the book, because and that's near the start. I've heard people casually, like my left-leaning friends, left-leaning, like really leftist, anarcho and socialist-y sort of types, make the common inheritance argument or something in that realm. And I think it's kind of, on a surface level, I can understand it. There's this element of it's kind of intuitive. Like, yeah, we're all a part of, so like, no man is an island there except for Satoshi. It's just lone soul. But no. Well, I mean, he's not, because money is an inherently social technology. So, the common inheritance argument is really interesting, because it is true on one level, which is we all do benefit from the accumulation of capital, the building up of infrastructure, the creation of buildings that last decades or centuries. And we benefit from the work of our ancestors, or, depending on what country you're in, like the ancestors of like the current inhabitants or whatever. And that is true. But the reason where it breaks down is that each step along the way towards creating this large common inheritance there have been obviously elements of like totalitarianism and like all that sort of stuff. But where it falls down is like, well, how do we keep on building it? And a lot of this stuff was built through property rights. And so when one person, say, gives up, say they've built a machine and then they give up that machine for, an ounce of gold to somebody who then goes and say it's during the 18th century and like the rise of steam engines, and say like an inventor has created a machine and they're selling these machines for an ounce of gold to each person. The person who buys the machine for the ounce of gold and then goes and uses the machine to create 3 ounces of gold worth of revenues, like the person who sold them that machine in the first place relinquished their property right on that machine when they engaged in the exchange. And so the issue is that all along the way, like there's transactions and transfers of property. And so, yeah, we benefit from the build-up of all of this, but of this like collective inheritance, as he says. But like, I don't have a claim on somewhat, like, say, I don't know, somebody else's house or whatever, even though I could say that like, well, that house was built by somebody else 100 years ago. Because all along the way, there's been transfers of property rights.
Which I guess Kropotkin views as illegitimate anyway.
And there are questions of like the legitimacy of transfers of property rights, even amongst libertarian thinkers. They think through like, are there times when property rights are violated and it means that a transaction is invalid or whatever, those sorts of things. And those are interesting questions. But this kind of nebulous, it leads you to, well, inevitably it leads to just collectivization of all the means of production. So you have to like come after the property rights. And whenever I talk to anybody about this sort of stuff, they inevitably dislike property rights in various forms. And yeah, I mean, if you say like we're going to abolish property because we think it's inherently evil, then I suppose like the collective inheritance thing probably makes sense.
Yeah. This was one of the more interesting parts of the book because it does make you really question the foundations of your society.
And there's definitely been times when, like, I'm not all like rosy goggles about it, like the period of colonization, for example, is a mark on human history where like capitalism was doing some good stuff, but then there are also like lots of, like the West Indies Trading Company, like they did lots of really horrible stuff, ostensibly in the name of, their corporation. And so you could say, well, capitalism was doing that, except at least a libertarian thinker or like a Austrian economist would say, no, they were, say like in the case of Australia, like when the British came and claimed land, what they did, in fact, if I were to put it in Western terms, like, because I'm from Sydney, which is like ground zero of colonization in Australia. Like, if I wanted to put the colonization issue into Western terms, I would say, like, my ancestors' property rights were violated by the colonists, and they actually did not, they actually broke their own Western ethic by violating the property rights of the existing owners of that land. They might not have been using it in a way that they recognized as property, but there's a whole conversation about that with the terra nullius stuff. But like colonization, I would make the argument that like a lot of colonization was actually like the part of the reason why it was so fucked up is because of the violation of property rights.
I wonder then, from an anarcho-communist position, if this sort of situation I can't really ever see happening, but for the sake of an interesting hypothetical, suppose if the colonists came and took the property of First Nations Australians, but basically communalized it, so everyone had an equal claim to it, would that for an anarcho-communist be okay?
That's a weird idea.
First Nations Australians would have a much lesser claim to their resources because now, however many colonists also now have claims to it, but everyone, there's no property rights. Everyone has equal claims to those things. Is that okay colonization?
Yeah, that's really weird, because if you just say, well, there's no property rights, then couldn't you just like walk around just being like, I'm now living here? Well, I guess that's why like in Berlin and stuff,
you go for like there is a branch of anarchism which
says you can just do that.
Does tend in that
and
direction.
Like all the squatting rights and stuff in places like Berlin, where it's just like, yep, now I'm living here.
Yeah.
And well, those places suck. So I don't know, like, like Berlin's a cool city and it's fun to party in and stuff, but also like their apartments and stuff are all shitty because they're fucking over the landlords, and like is that just because shitty rental laws. So I don't know, if you want to live in a crappy city like Berlin, go right the fuck ahead. But like, if you want to live in a city with good houses where the landlords have the rights to kick out like shitty tenants, then like go and live somewhere else. But I don't know, like this idea that, okay, so let me think. So we're colonists. We're going to go over to the New World, and we're not going to steal their property because
like they can use the boats and things.
So
they have a claim to that.
So they were just like, you can have our boat and you can just sail off into wherever you want, and we'll just be here.
You don't necessarily understand this technology, but have at it.
And we're just going to sit here now. That's on the assumption that like the people who are inhabiting that land are just like, yeah, cool with that, and that they don't just say, no, get the fuck off our land.
Yeah, but that's when you have to start explaining it to them
that property rights
they need to understand. That's when you start handing out copies of the Conquest of Bread to First Nations Australians. It's like, listen, I know you don't understand this language. You've got to understand
Captain Phillip,
why you need to accept that we also own this property
collectively.
Well, none of you own this property. You don't own it.
It's the collective inheritance of all mankind. Yeah, it's an extremely European philosophy.
Yeah. Can you imagine? It's like one of the people meeting the First Fleet, like, eventually learns English and then like is trying to understand them explaining to this particular person the principles of anarcho-communism and why actually everyone owns everything in common. It's the common inheritance, which is why this group of strangers now is living on your land.
Well, the weird thing is, like, there are like parallels if I look at some extant communities that live in various forms of I don't know if you want to say tribal, but like they still practice, say, like their pre-European spirituality and various forms of like social structures and all that sort of stuff. There is a kind in some parts of the country, or if you just look over like the anthropological records written by Europeans, but like I guess like taking them in good faith, because you don't really have a better strategy. Like there were elements of these societies, or are elements of this society that are kind of communist or anarchistic in many ways. But there's still property, like, and there's still hierarchies and stuff. So it's not completely, but I would say that's more of a consequence of like being small populations. Like a lot of this stuff can work in very small populations where you have like, for example, in a lot of Aboriginal communities in Australia, like there's these things called kinship systems, and these kinship systems can be really complex, but they're basically like inherited and evolved systems of assigning social roles to people based on like their inheritance within like the community, but it has stuff to do with like spirituality and stuff. And so it might be like, well, you're this particular skin name because your father was this skin name and your mother was this skin name, and so you have this social role. Those sorts of things so then we can allocate you like this role in society, and you might be eligible to have like, these claims on the community. But that stuff can work when you have like a kinship system, or when you have small families, or even in like the Western atomic family, nuclear family, like you have a very small number of people with concrete relationships with one another. But as soon as you start scaling up to the point where it's like, well, what if you have like 100, say, tribes? If you took 100 Aboriginal First Nations peoples, and they all have different kinship systems, and then they wanted to form like a government, a state or something, it's like, well, what kinship system are we going to use? They wouldn't use a kinship system. They'd have to come up with some other form of governance that's abstract and doesn't have anything to do with their kinship systems in order for them to do that. And so as you get bigger and larger like populations with less and less common inheritance culturally, you have to have more and more abstract, basically, technologies and rules of engagement, to the point where I just don't think it's at all feasible to do what Kropotkin is saying, even in the 19th century in Europe, when you're talking about populations of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And again, like Europe, very, 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 very complex kinship systems historically, and social relations and all that sort of stuff.
You basically just brought up a point I was wanting to make at some point in this episode where, well, again, it's sort of what I was referring to earlier with the coordination problem, is it with these sorts of anarchist ideas, they probably could work on a small scale where people have enough buy-in and know each other. So there's some sort of social regulation going on in terms of people's behavior. Yeah. But if you had a population the size of, I don't know, Australia in 2023, it's about 25.5 million people, you can't have some sort of social regulation going on between enough of those people to make sure people behave in the sort of way that would lead to a society that you would want to live in. It just feels like there's not really a scalable coordination solution from anarchism.
Kropotkin Bot 3000 is going to respond to this. This is Levi's Kropotkin Bot. So,
yeah, yes, please.
And he does sort of touch on this in the book. He says he talks about the communes he talks a lot about in the countryside, but eventually affecting the metropolitan centres as well. I think he would say something along the lines of, well, there'll be lots of decentralized, small-scale communities where they, in fact, can do that, do these things, because they do have concrete relationships with their neighbours. So you might be talking about on the scale of hundreds, or even maybe communities of like a few thousand people could potentially do this, because you could then lean on not direct concrete relations, but at least communal reputation. And if you have many of these fairly small communities distributed around doing their own communal private expropriation and reallocation of the means of production, and each one of those are like communicating and interfacing with one another, then it would work. But you don't need this like one overall, like across all of France or all of Germany or whatever. You don't need that.
I think that's that's a possible solution, but I guess then we run into that problem you were saying earlier. You were talking about earlier when we were discussing the expropriation during the revolution. It works so long as people behave in the way that Kropotkin wants them to behave.
Yeah, but they will.
But there's not really much stopping one particular commune deciding to invade another commune.
No, but haven't you ever witnessed the good, kind heart and wise soul of a worker in the field and how just and fair they are when they're distributing the leftover wares of their toil? Haven't you seen that? You know they're going to act fair when they interact with another Jack.
So the thing is, I think broadly speaking, people as individuals are overwhelmingly kind. They don't want to go out of their way to hurt other people. Oftentimes they will go out of their way to help other people. The thing is, when you start getting people organising into groups, they tend to get a whole lot crueler.
Yeah, that's definitely something he didn't deal with in this book.
And this thing where people will organise into communes and those communes will interact with each other peaceably, it strikes me that in organisations is exactly when human beings start behaving at their worst. Like you're organising a group of organs that make people behave in a much less humane way to each other and then making those interact. And to my, granted, Kropotkin would probably say this is because I've been indoctrinated into a capitalist way of thinking about social relations. But to me, that just sounds like a recipe to have those communes start invading each other or fighting with each other.
Yeah, and what if one commune says we've got like this historical claim because, you know, some part of our ancestry like lived over in here where that's now currently being occupied by this other commune and we want that part of our land back, you know, and there's plenty of parts in Europe where that's the case. Like in Czech, right? There's Czech and
basically, yeah, like you get Czech people talking about parts of Poland that should definitely belong to the Czech people.
So imagine if there wasn't a nation state EU thing there, like, and they were just a bunch of communes. Like, do you reckon that like the people would have? Yeah, well, I don't have to ask that question in the abstract. That has happened throughout the course of human history.
That is just European history.
Yeah,
because then you could say, oh well, it's good to organise such that you have a defensive capability to discourage others from trying that. The problem is, once you have that sort of defensive capability, people might start thinking, oh, well, what do we have all these attack helicopters for? Sitting around, feeling sad that they're not flying around shooting people.
Yeah, so this is...
Just a bit, you're wasting these. A poor starving child in Africa could be using this attack helicopter, and you've got it, and you're wasting it.
Yeah, so this is why he says at the beginning, probably in multiple places, but I remember early on in the beginning of the book, he says, we are utopians. We are unashamedly utopians. And the problem with utopianism, there's many problems, but I can think of three main problems off the top of my head that I'd say make utopianism in general just completely dysfunctional. One, who sets the standards for what is utopian? Two is who gets to plan and then execute that plan? And then three, what if your idea of utopia is wrong and you need to change your plan?
It is interesting in that those questions tend to come back to questions of authority, which is something that anarchism seeks to address by saying that you shouldn't have organised, institutionalised systems of authority with coercive power over others. But almost the internal calculus of anarchism presupposes that there is some authority in terms of how you should behave.
Yeah, or that somehow you'll just magically do the right thing.
Yeah, that there is a right way to act.
And since it's socialist anarchism without property rights. So at least, like, I've been reading some anarcho-capitalists and, like, hardcore libertarianism. And, you know, it's it's challenging. Like, some of it's pretty out there thinking. But, you know, one of the key points, at least, they resolve some of these issues by referring to property rights. And I don't know if I think it all stacks up. I mean, I've got to read a little bit more of it to make a decision. But, you know, like, to me, at least, some of the functioning parts of, like, Western societies, the reason why you can have, say, the Mormons and the Nation of Islam and Pentecostals and atheists and communists and entrepreneurs all living in a country like, like obviously Australia, the US, those sorts of countries all living together, is because those countries have struck this balance between having an abstract form of governance and government that largely tries not to discriminate based on arbitrary grounds, and also people have property rights and they can make their own local decisions about I want to live in an Amish community and just hang out with Amish people, and maybe we'll sell our wares to the outside world and use that to live our Amish lifestyle, but we're not actually going to tell other people to be Amish. It's like some of the stuff that Kropotkin's trying to do is actually supported by giving communities and individuals stronger property rights. And I'd say a lot of the issues that he's pointed out come from the fact that huge parts of the population in Russia was something like 30% of the population were serfs. Government serfs, that doesn't include private serfs. So when you have an entire part of the population that historically not only did not have property rights, but they themselves were property of others, tied, in the case of serfdom, you're tied to the land rather than tied to the individual. The issue there was that those people didn't have property rights. It wasn't because these other people had property rights. So the solution to a lot of the things that he's saying is not to take away property rights from the people who do have property rights, it's to strengthen property rights for everyone.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that he said that there were all sorts of different revolutions that could happen, but only one revolution could be successful.
The one with bread.
How about we talk a bit about what a successful revolution to Kropotkin would look like?
Yeah.
Because he does... It's a combination of hand-waving and, for an anarcho-communist, a surprising amount of prescription that he offers when it comes to what a successful revolution looks like. He says that probably the biggest killer of any revolution is the question of bread. So during the heady early days of revolution, when everyone's full of revolutionary fervor, they're willing to undergo all sorts of privations and deprivations because they're hopeful for the future. But if people get hungry enough, they're going to become disillusioned with the revolution, and then the forces of counter-revolution can start filling people's heads with reactionary ideas like, well, you got more food before the revolution, so why don't you turn against it? And so for Kropotkin, it's vitally important during the revolution to secure enough food for the average person. And the way this is done is by expropriating food. So you talked earlier about how you would have groups of volunteers, as he calls them somewhat euphemistically, people who volunteer to take other people's stuff and distribute it. Groups of volunteers will take stock of all of the food stores within a particular geographic area and then distribute those on the basis of need. And that keeps people fed in the initial parts of the revolution, but also very quickly, people need to start working out how to start using the land in their area to start making food. And because anarchism naturally tends towards the utilization of more efficient technologies of production than capitalism, they're going to start using land in more effective ways and using more advanced forms of agriculture to produce more per unit area of farmland. Like with that part, I guess it might just be because I've grown up in a society where there is a greater degree of organization when it comes to utilizing land that I have a hard time seeing how that's going to be coordinated without property rights and without any sort of institution designating which parts of the land will be used for farming.
Yeah.
Without one of those two coordination methods.
So
I guess that's the objection that Kropotkin would have.
He correctly identified that, hey, starvation and privation, pretty bad for a revolution.
Yeah. They're going to kill the revolution.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's true. He identified that's how counter-revolutionary forces can start breaking down people's revolutionary fervor.
But it's just like when you wipe out... Okay, ideology. I know, Levi's very ideological.
It's basically like you
wipe out the mechanism for coordination.
Almost the mechanism for generating things or producing things. So you wipe that out, and then you have to work out how to generate things using a new system.
Again, I'm going to speak just purely from the benefit of an extra 150 years of intellectual development in our world. Like, so criticize him. He's not an idiot.
What do you mean? I love judging people in the past based on what we believe today.
He's not an idiot. He was just like ignorant given the time that he was.
No, he's far from idiot. No, this is a worthwhile book.
But like, one of the things that he says when he's talking about this problem is he's like, okay, the roaming bands of volunteers will go in and expropriate the means of production and the factories. And you'll get the factory, he says, you'll tell the factory workers, we're going to secure for you your food, and you guarantee them that they're going to get their food. And then you say, okay, but you need to start making stuff for the farmers because they need to keep on making the food. So that's part of the problem. But just before that, or along the way, but especially before that, the volunteers, quote unquote, need to go in and take stock of the current, take account of the current stock of bread. I'm just going to use bread.
An orderly inventory.
I'm just going to use bread. I think you can think of the word bread as not just food, but in general, like necessities, consumable necessities for life. So that would mean bread and food, but more generally, it would also mean just like
internet,
food, Pornhub, Bitcoin, all those things that one needs to survive. The basics.
The basics.
And so they go in, they take over the factory and the storehouses. They take account of all the food and all the bread.
How much Pornhub is here? How many units of Pornhub does this capitalist pig have?
And they start allocating it to people. What he doesn't think through is I'm just going to use a computer science term, but it's called a computational complexity. It's like, okay, how much computational power do you need to calculate a particular algorithm, to like perform a particular algorithm as the size of the input to that algorithm scales? And in this case, part of what the price system is actually doing is it's essentially like, another way of putting it is, it's allowing us not to do certain computations. And those computations that we need to do would be the computations that Kropotkin is saying that his bands of volunteers should do, which is go in and take stock of absolutely everything, take stock of every single person and their needs, and then distribute that information out to everybody before those stockpiles of food go rotten, take back everybody's requests, and then assign in some way, based on some like criterion of priority, to everybody as that much as they quote unquote need. That is actually like no small task. Like if you're talking about 10 people, maybe you could do it, but how does that scale to 100 people or 1,000 people or a town of 10,000 people? Okay, a town of 10,000 people is going to have tons of wheat. It's going to have tons of corn or whatever the local thing is. It's going to have hundreds of cattle, hundreds of sheep. It's going to have 10,000 people. They're all going to have different wants. Like this just gets to the point of just the actual sitting down and thinking through how to do this. The computational complexity and how much management that would need would basically absorb all of their labor to figure that out. And this is pre-computers, this guy's writing. Like that, and he's also talking about people who are probably not very literate and probably not numerate.
And who are hungry.
And who are in the middle of a potentially violent revolution. Like he just didn't think at all through like the practicality of this stuff.
Okay, so I'll answer this.
Kropotkin bot.
First of all, as Kropotkin bot.
I love this. We should do this every episode.
And then I'll offer based on my pioneering work as an oven bot, we've worked. and then I'll offer an answer against Kropotkin bot as Jack bot. And I'll be simulating Jack in my brain. So as Kropotkin, he said that you're not actually calculating what people need because it's going to be, well, you're not going to calculate what people need because that is done by the person who wants something. So they're going to come up to whichever place is distributing food and just say what they want. And so it can be distributed on that basis. So you're not actually having to calculate. Yeah, basically. You're not going to have to calculate what all of the different needs of this, of however many people you're administering to or not administering to. You would be administering, but it's not coercive.
And it's not centralized,
it's not
and there's no central organisation.
And it's not centralized.
In this administration.
Yeah, so you don't have the computational complexity because people just say what they want, and because of their innate goodness, they're not going to demand too much. So you're not going to have someone like me come in and say, I want your entire bread stores.
Mamma mia, I forgot.
Take the bread stores and then demand fealty from people if they're going to receive bread.
I forgot that they would just
demand genuflection.
They would only ask for exactly what they need, and they would do it in a just and fair way. Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that.
And now as a non-Kropotkin bot answer, what's to stop two rival groups of volunteers taking bread? And who mediates between these two rival groups of volunteers when they want the same piece of bread?
And here again, Levi's taken on Kropotkin.
And this is where you run into might makes right again, because it's going to shake out into, well, which group can violently convince the other one.
Kropotkin bot Levi edition says no, there won't be rival groups of thugs. Volunteers. There will be.
You need to work out this bug in your particular version of Kropotkin bot, which keeps replacing volunteers with the thugs. That's a bit
because
bug,
everybody is embodying the same uniform sense of revolutionary fervor and brotherhood and solidarity. There will always and everywhere only ever be one band of volunteers, and they will not be coercive, and they will all be able to collaborate. And so that's just not even a problem that's going to happen. There won't be rival volunteer bands.
No, but you see Kropotkin bot running on Levi hardware. My problem with that is when you look at the leftist revolutions through history, they tend to be very passionate, but one thing they're not good at is not infighting. It is a specialty of the left. You get riotous infighting, but riotous are absolute amateurs when it comes to infighting when you compare them to leftists. So they are the undisputed masters of infighting. I'm pretty sure there would be a lot of rival gangs of volunteers.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I can try to embody Kropotkin, but at some point I'm just gonna have to say, well, it won't. That won't happen. Sorry.
Yeah, which actually is channeling Kropotkin bot.
That's the final answer to everything. Well, you're just wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big one. So essentially if I could summarize this in Levi's typically terse, rambling...
terse and rambling.
Summaries. Whenever I say I'm going to summarize something quickly, it inevitably turns into a rant. I'll try not to turn this into a rant.
Turn into us talking about jelking and Bitcoin.
He talks about, essentially what he's saying is they're going to ration things.
Yeah.
In the absence of property rights, a monetary technology and a price system, they're going to ration things, which, to be fair, is what you have to do. That is actually what you have to do if you're going to get rid of money.
But the thing is, you've removed... So the three things you just mentioned are all, in some way, coordination systems.
Yeah.
So ways of coordinating scarce resources or limited resources and needs. And I'm not sure how you coordinate it once you take away or you take off the table those coordination systems.
And his answer to that is essentially... that rationing system is going to be unbelievably inefficient, unbelievably poor at communicating information to everybody. And, he says it's not going to be centralized, but, there's just, you have one or two storehouses. in like a community of grain. Like it's going to be centralized. It's going to be physically centralized, and then in order to protect that with security and that sort of stuff, so people don't steal, and organizationally, like these things will just become centralized. You can't get out of that.
Yeah, well, in the absence of ways of restraining power, centralization arises as soon as you have someone with a sharpened stick standing in the doorway of the storehouse.
Yeah, the tallest peasant with the sharpest pitchfork is going to stand in front of the grain house and say, well, no, we're not just going to like hand it out to everybody. Like I'm going to keep some to myself and my family. And so he's basically not dealt with these issues, and his hand wavy response is to say, well, people will just because of the better angels of our nature, when the revolutionary fervor sweeps the nation, will all act in each other's best interests in justice and fairness and brotherhood. And like essentially when you start talking about that sort of stuff, like you're essentially just being like religious or quasi-religious, and like just saying, well, this will happen just because. And I don't like you can't really respond to that other than just to say like, fine, go and sit over there in the corner and just try not to break anything, please. Luckily, that's what the anarchists have actually done.
And I feel like, so I reflexively think that defending human freedom is a good thing. And
because you've been indoctrinated.
That's not a particularly examined first principle. Or it's the sort of thing where, I think it was Isaiah Berlin who said, you can't change your first principles, you can only love them. And so I love that first principle within that paradigm. And Kropotkin shares, I think, a large part of that first principle. Where we differ, and this is quite a fundamental difference, is he thinks that you are best able to free people by having a society without formalized power structures. And within such a society, people are free. Whereas I think people have this, at least certain people will seek to dominate others. And the best way to try to defend human freedom is to constrain those impulses.
Yeah. And that is that's probably like, for me at least, sentimentally, I have, especially as I've gotten older and gotten more and more into Bitcoin, just become sentimentally more and more like anarcho-capitalist libertarian. But the thing that stops me from going all the way down into that form of thinking is just like, and to be fair, I haven't read, maybe there's some retort to what I'm about to say, but like, one of the roles of democracy for the anarcho-libertarians who like want to completely get rid of democracy, the issue is that like, for better or worse, and to the degree that a country has a more or less functional democracy, it does actually serve this profound role of constraining that lust for power and channeling it in a way where there's balances and checks. And maybe there will be maybe we will figure out a better way to do it in the future without a state, and that would be really interesting and cool, and I would love to live to see that. And if it's a good idea, hopefully it works and people are prosperous and all that sort of stuff. But since I'm not living in that part of history and I can't make that judgment, empirical assessment yet, for lack of seeing anything better, it seems as though like these democracies that have like some state and constrain those sorts of people and try to like mitigate the amount of damage they can do, and then lets everybody else engage in a free and open market, like with property rights, seems to be a fairly good system, notwithstanding there's always going to be issues.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I doubt there's ever going to be a perfect system because perfection's a bit of a moving target and a nebulously defined moving target. And so what's the least bad, or what's a system which gets the most of whatever collection of outcomes you want as compared to other systems?
Yeah, and so again, I'm not going to go on a Popper and Deutsch rant, but this is really just like Levi's I haven't found a better argument than what Popper and Deutsch put forward, which is basically like this system essentially allows people at a local scale to be able to solve problems. And what we want societies that are stable at the level of like politics over time. There's a fair bit of stability, but there's dynamism in that like the culture can change and solve problems as new problems arise. And the key issue here being the utopians, like all the Marxists and socialists and stuff, is they don't realize that that problems occur at all scales, from the local to the international, and new problems can arise in the future. In fact, if the species lives another million years or however much long it lives, presumably there'll be more problems in the future than there are now. And most of them are not foreseeable. I can't predict them now. And so you really don't want a society that is static and doesn't have the means for adapting to new problems as they arise.
Yeah. Okay, what else is there to talk about with Kropotkin?
I think, where did we get, are there any insights? So we have insights of anarchism. Were there any, oh yeah, maybe there was one insight that we sort of touched on a little bit before, but like, do we need to unpack it much more? The emergent order stuff. They have an interest.
We talked about that earlier.
I think we talked about it enough. So the last point I have is, where did Kropotkin hit the mark versus where did he have like a close miss?
So the emergent order stuff that we've talked about is an insight that is touching on something real. In terms of, so this was not limited to Kropotkin, the prediction that under capitalism, the lot of particularly urban workers would just continue to get worse and worse. During their lives, that was very much the trajectory. People were getting paid less, working conditions were getting worse, work was getting more unstable in terms of whether they would have it the next day or not. And that, at least, so the big caveat is in Western countries, on the whole, so things like the gig economy are making some parts of work less predictable again. But on the whole, conditions have improved, pay has improved. What has happened in other countries, that's less clear, in that a lot of the more unpleasant parts of work have been offshored, and so people in lower income nations are being paid wages far below those of people in Western nations to produce goods cheaply for consumption in Western nations. That's something that Lenin particularly hit on. Yeah. And then Trotskyists also talked a lot about that. But I think directionally Kropotkin got it wrong on the whole with that part of his thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one point that he did pick up on, which again, like Bitcoin rant, but he did identify that like the peasants, at one point he's talking about money and how the peasants wanted to be paid in gold. They didn't want to be given paper currency.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
He did identify that there is, like, even in our current system under fiat credit capitalism, there is theft going on. Like, monetary expansion is theft. So it's quite abstract. So you have to like think about it for a second to realize that like, I mean, if people want to look into it, you can look at this thing called the Cantillon effect. It's really interesting. But long story short, like, if you think into the 19th century, okay, say there's the French Revolution and they centralize the government, and then they say like this new government walks into a town and the local economy is operating presumably on gold as the primary like medium of exchange of like large scale purchases like land and stuff, but probably for smaller purchases they were probably using silver, maybe copper, probably not copper, but at that point in history, but silver and gold. Like Europe essentially like evolved into a bimetallic standard where gold was used for storing value over a long period of time and for large purchases, and silver, because it has like a lower purchasing power per unit weight, was used for like smaller purchases. And so if like an outsider walks into your community and they said, well, you're on French territory and now we're going to get off, whether it was pre-revolution under the king or whether it was post-revolution under like the new French state, whatever, what was it called, the national, whatever, those, like, can you blame the peasants for saying, no, fuck you, I'm not going to use your paper money? Like, because presumably in Paris, you've got a paper printer, you can just print off more. Like, it's not like peasants might have been poor, doesn't mean they were stupid. Like, they're using gold. They know that gold can't just be like printed like piece of paper money can be. So they're going to use gold to do their transactions. And so it's almost like there were parts of the systemic theft of wealth through the monetary technology, which he was kind of getting close to, but because it got wrapped up, sort of his ideology got wrapped up with the Marxist analysis of the value theory of prices and his denigration of property rights, sort of like didn't quite, he couldn't distinguish between those closely related problems. Yeah, which is, yeah, to be fair, like, again, like, it's a complex issue, and I have historical hindsight, so.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. He did acknowledge, or he understood that governments don't necessarily have much of an interest in keeping the money supply stable in a way that allows people to save money or store their labor or some sort of wealth for later. They also have incentives to try to buy people off.
Yeah.
By giving them more of this quote unquote money or value.
Yeah.
In certain situations when people need to be mollified.
In both the French, like when the French went, like, I mean, it's happened in a lot of wars, but I in particular look at, I think during the US, like during the Civil War, like they paid people in, was it in, I might be getting my wires crossed here, but I think they pay in the North. Part of the reason why they were able to finance the war is they promised the soldiers, they paid the soldiers in notes, or they promised them land, and then they either reneged on the promises of land or they reneged on the redeemability of the notes into gold. And so basically being able to like print fake money and then like issue it and like pay for the things that, you know, like the war rations or the property, you know, all of that works off trust or potentially coercion. In the case of like the American the American Civil War, it was like the trust of the Northern soldiers had that like these promissory notes would maintain their convertibility back to gold after the war, and that trust was broken. And so like there is this huge systemic issue. Don't quote me on any of that stuff. I might be wrong. Like my brains.
I'm updating Wikipedia as we speak.
Yeah. But, you know, these sorts of things have happened throughout history, you know, like whether it was the Weimar Republic, like printing shitloads of money, or like, you know, like Churchill, like fucking with the money supply to go into World War II, those sorts of things. Like, you know, I think, how would I put it? I think like people kind of intuitively understand that this is like a thing that can be fucked with. And so it's just complex enough that like it's actually taken a lot of really smart people a lot of their lives and a lot of arguing with one another to get to the point where now in 2023 we can say like with quite a lot of robust arguments like what money is, how it works, why it should not, like what are the effects of like expanding the monetary supply and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it's not that governments don't have the incentive to keep their money stable, because obviously they don't want hyperinflation and just a complete collapse of their monetary system. But at the same time, that's not the only incentive they have. At various points, they also can have the incentive to print lots of it to make people think that times are better than they actually are. Yeah.
Or to save the banking cartel.
Yeah. Yeah, or to fund things that they can't pay for.
Yeah,
that
like war.
Yeah, that in the immediate short term, it looks like they can pay for if they just expand the money supply.
Yeah, so, yeah, I you know, it's hard because, what were you saying about first principles, Jack? Like, it's like, you've said this a number of times in episodes, and I love it when you say it, is like, you say, okay, if I adopt this person's like starting principles or starting assumptions, then I can see where they're coming from. And in the case of Kropotkin, if I kind of squint and adopt like, okay, I'm going to get rid of my like get rid of the property rights stuff, and kind of squint, I can see where he's trying to, how he's trying to make the world better, especially for like poor people in Europe, given that he thinks that property rights are part of the problem.
Yeah, and occupying Kropotkin's headspace isn't totally alien for me, given that there are a lot of things that I broadly agree on, in that I think that most human action is self-organized. It's not something that takes place because it has been commanded to by some coercive body.
Yeah.
It's just I don't go to the point of saying that there can be no coercive bodies, that they're always bad, and that similarly humans will always self-organize into some sort of society that I would want to live in.
Yeah.
That's a first principle I don't share with him.
Yeah. So my question would be for us, Jack, or for myself, but whether or not this comes through on the show. I was wondering, okay, like I've read some socialist stuff now and, you know, some fascist stuff and all this, whatever. I would like to read a book, whether it's on the show or in my own time, that actually really challenges my views with regards to all this, what you might think of as like liberalism and capitalism stuff that I broadly agree with. Like it would, like this book, for example, it was interesting to read, but I didn't feel as though it actually challenged my perspective in a meaningful. What I mean by challenge, like it challenged it in the sense of it disagrees with me, but it's like I don't find it difficult to dispatch with his point of view. I don't find it compelling, and I find there's so many easily pointed out and elucidated errors in his thinking that it's not actually. I don't find it challenging to disagree with this. Whereas it would be really interesting to find like a thinker. If shout out to any of our listeners on the Discord or on Twitter or whatever, like if you can suggest like an actual, whether it's a socialist or an anarchist or some other ideology which Jack and I don't know about, who is actually like really heavy hitting, like this person actually brings like a really heavy attack on essentially all the stuff that Jack and I have obviously agreed with regards to property rights and Bitcoin and all that sort of shit, you know? That would be interesting to read.
Yeah, that would be really good.
I just haven't found it yet. Maybe it's for lack of looking, perhaps.
Yeah. So, would you recommend this book? Because I would.
Yeah.
I'd recommend this one because it's well written. It's not very long.
It's really interesting.
It's still, I mean, insofar as anarchism is still a relevant mass movement, this book is relevant because this is one of the important works of anarcho-communism, or of left anarchism more broadly. Yeah. And it's not like he's not coming from a malicious place. He genuinely wants the world to be a better place, and he's not LARPing, malicious, as you said earlier in the episode. And I like his instincts of not trusting centralized authority and coercive powers and things like that. That I can definitely get behind.
Yeah, I would recommend it. So here's my caveat with all of my recommendations, actually. I think that unless you're particularly reflexive on the way that you do the learning, it's very important to pay attention to the way that you sequence the books that you read. And what I mean by that is that the books that I read when I was younger and the things that I learnt when I was younger have conditioned me now to have like either they're explicit or they're inexplicit, and that like I kind of have them as working assumptions, but I don't really think about them that much anymore. Things around like philosophy and economics and science and physics and all that sort of stuff has conditioned me now when I come up against a thinker like Kropotkin, where I can just think through, okay, here's computer science issues, here's pricing system issues, here's economics issues, like here's all these different issues with what he's thinking. And so it's prepared me with the ability to like engage with it really critically. And that's because of actually the sequencing of my learning. So if, in fact, I had learned all these things the other way around, where I went and learned about socialist philosophy and Marxism and all that sort of stuff, and I wasn't able to then critically self-reflect on that learning, I could go and then learn about, say, Mises and not be able to engage with his insights. And then, obviously, because like I like what Mises says, like I think Mises is largely right in his analysis. So what's this all to mean? What I mean is, like, I think some of the issues with why, say, like the Occupy movement went wrong, because a lot of the people who engaged with that movement, they correctly identified that there's like an issue here. Yeah, the banking cartel and centralized banking is fucking everything up in the economy. But because maybe the lack of economic education in the population, when they went to engage with ideas like Kropotkin or socialist stuff, they can't see all of the like very serious critiques of these ways of thinking that like actually don't work. And so if you haven't like sequenced your thinking or sequenced your learning well, where you've got like really good strong foundations and like first principles to work on, you just need to be careful when you're getting into ideological literature, because your like only defense against these sorts of ideologies is essentially like strong first principles thinking.
I guess I have a different approach to this sort of thing than you. My approach is volume, that just take in a lot of different perspectives without worrying too much about sequencing. And when you read them, just trying to have the posture of, okay, what's this person trying to convince me of? Understanding that they are trying to bring you around to their point of view, and just seeing enough examples to eventually develop a sense of what makes sense and what doesn't. I'm not sure which approach is better. That's just how I've approached things.
Yeah. And I think, like, if you're, like, just say Jack is a very fast reader and he reads quite a lot. And if you can do that, that's also a good strategy. Maybe the core of the strategy would really be like, okay, maybe here's a better way to put it. Rather than sequencing is one way to get to the same outcome as Jack's volume approach. Are we talking here about working out or bodybuilding? Is that essentially like you want to, like, in order to not basically have your mind hijacked by an ideology, even though you might say that Levi's been hijacked by like liberalism. I mean, fucking hell, can't get out of the trap, can you? Like, you need to expose yourself to like alternative points of view, and preferably you have some quality control of that. And really, like, the quality control comes from being able to pull on really strong arguments that either other people have put forward or that you've come up with yourself for or against these different perspectives. So at least in the Jack's volume approach, he could still get the same thing that I'm talking about if he just reads enough and doesn't worry too much about sequencing.
Yeah, one other way that really helps is knowing people whom you trust to be good faith in telling you about their beliefs, who believe different things to you, and talking to them about what they believe. So some upgraded version of Kropotkin bot, an actual anarchist, an actual
like a 21st century Kropotkin bot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you can talk to someone who sincerely believes these things and isn't just going to yell at you and tell you you're a bad person for asking them why they believe these things, that's a really good way to learn about different perspectives. That is harder than buying a book and reading it, but if you can do that, I really recommend it.
Yeah, but with that caveat, sorry, I don't know why I wanted to say that. I just feel like, we've recommended books in the past.
It's a good thing to bring up.
Yeah, because like obviously like reading these books is really interesting, but I guess I try to be open-minded, but I don't necessarily think that just having an open mind is just a priori good thing. Like, if you have just an open mind and you just let anybody pour anything into it, that's just a recipe for disaster. Like, you've got to
you need to overwhelm your own capacity for discernment. That's a good thing.
You need to be discerning or critical and open-minded.
No critical capacity.
And if you can do that, then like read this book. It's really good. It's really interesting, and read about history. Book. Yeah.
In terms of listener questions, do you want to just do a separate episode for listener questions? Because We keep getting to the end of episodes and I'm just kind of tired.
Yeah.
And I just won't give questions as much time as I probably would otherwise if I were fresh.
The next week or two, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Let's schedule in a questions episode. What have we... Oh, we've got furry comics next. Yeah, that's different to Kropotkin.
All right, well, that'll be fun at least.
That'll be fun.
Nice. Thanks for listening.
See ya.